Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The Legend of the River Ghosts. The sun was dipping low behind the trees as I drove down the narrow, winding road toward the cabin. The kind of place that seemed forgotten by time, nestled in the heart of Mississippi, far from the bustling world I'd left behind. I had rented this cabin for a few days to clear my mind, to escape the noise and demands of daily life. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and I could already feel the weight of isolation settling in. The cabin stood at the edge of a wide river, the kind that flowed lazily through the landscape, winding its way through the trees as if it had no purpose other than to exist. Its water was dark and still, reflecting the sky above in a perfect mirror. But there was something about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The evening was quiet, too quiet. Not a single bird sang, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. It felt as though the entire world had paused for a moment, holding its breath. I stepped out of my car and looked toward the river. The trees stood tall on either side, their branches reaching out like fingers, their leaves barely stirring in the still air. The water, though calm, seemed almost too smooth. As I stood there, staring at its glassy surface, I couldn't help but feel like it was hiding something beneath. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unsettling thought. It was just a river. Just a river. But the longer I stared, the more the water seemed to pulse, as though it were alive. The quiet was suffocating. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breath and the occasional creak of the cabin behind me. It was peaceful, in a way, but in another, it felt wrong. Something was off about this place, but I couldn't figure out what. The door to the cabin creaked as I opened it, the dim light from inside casting long shadows across the porch. I stepped inside, but the strange feeling from the river didn't leave me. It lingered, tugging at the edges of my thoughts. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the quiet, the isolation. After all, who wouldn't feel a little on edge in a place this remote? I unpacked my things, trying to focus on the small comforts of being in a new space, getting my books out, arranging things just so. Yet, every now and then, my eyes would wander back to the window, as if I expected to see something move out there on the water. The air outside had turned cooler, and the fading light of day made everything look more mysterious, as though the world itself was hiding secrets. I stood by the window for a long while, staring out into the gathering darkness, the feeling of being watched creeping over me once again. I didn't know what I was expecting to see. Nothing came. But I couldn't shake the sense that the river, silent, endless, and dark, was waiting for something, too. The night deepened, and the quiet outside grew even more profound. It was the kind of silence that pressed in on all sides, thick and heavy. I tried to relax in the cabin, reading a book I had brought, but the words seemed to blur as my mind kept drifting back to the window, back to the river. The unsettling feeling that had been gnawing at me all evening didn't go away. It only grew, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. I heard it then, just a faint, distant sound. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the trees, but it was different. It wasn't the usual creak of branches swaying in the breeze. It was a soft, rhythmic splash. Like something, or someone, was moving through the water. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I stood up and walked to the window, trying to peer out into the darkness. The river was still, the surface smooth as glass, the moonlight casting long, trembling shadows across the water. There was nothing there. No ripples, no signs of movement. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Just the wind, maybe, or the sound of an animal in the distance. The woods here were thick, filled with wildlife. It was easy to imagine that a deer or a raccoon had wandered too close to the riverbank and caused a ripple. I sighed, pressing my palms against the cool glass, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But then the sound came again, clearer this time. A soft, deliberate splash, followed by a second, and then a third. The rhythm was steady, like footsteps on water. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to hear. I rushed to the door, stepping out onto the porch and into the night air. The world was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon. The air felt thick, pressing against me, making each breath feel labored. The river, now only a few feet away, was quiet once more. I squinted into the night, trying to make sense of what I had heard. The water was undisturbed, its surface still as ever. There were no signs of movement, no shapes floating in the dark. It must have been an animal, I told myself. A deer. Maybe a bird landing on the water, making the odd splashing sound. There was no way it could have been anything else. I tried to shake the thought from my mind and turned back toward the cabin. My feet dragged through the grass, the sound of the earth crunching beneath my boots louder than the silence around me. The river seemed even darker now, its presence heavy and oppressive. Inside, I locked the door behind me and settled back into the chair. My hands were trembling, and my chest felt tight. I forced myself to take deep, steady breaths. It was nothing. Just the wind, or a raccoon. I tried to focus on the book in my lap, but the eerie sound from the water lingered in my mind, echoing in the silence. I closed my eyes for a moment, and when I opened them again, I found myself staring at the window, the night outside as still and lifeless as ever. But I couldn't escape the feeling that something was waiting for me on the other side. Something I couldn't see, but that was already too close for comfort. The hours dragged on as I sat in the dim light of the cabin, trying to ignore the growing discomfort gnawing at me. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant howling of the wind outside. But my mind refused to quiet. The sounds from the river had returned, more persistent now, and more distinct. The rhythmic splashes came in intervals, almost like a pattern. I stood up, my legs stiff from sitting for too long, and walked to the window once more. The river was still as ever, its black surface reflecting the cold moonlight in a way that felt wrong. There was no sign of movement on the water, no ripples, nothing. But the sounds, they were still there. Faint at first, then growing louder, unmistakable now. It was as if someone was walking on the water itself, each step sinking into the surface with a soft but audible splash, followed by a brief pause before the next step. I felt my heart begin to race, a sense of dread settling deep in my stomach. My eyes searched the riverbank in the dim light, desperate for any sign of life. A person? No, it was impossible. The water was too still, too calm. No one could be out there, no one could walk across the river like that. And yet, the sounds continued. Step after step, each one dragging on, eerily close to the cabin. A shiver ran down my spine, and I stepped back from the window, my breath quickening. What was I hearing? Could it be an animal? But the sound of footsteps was too deliberate, too human. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me. I had been isolated for too long, my mind wandering. The wind, the shifting trees, it was all part of the strange atmosphere here. But deep down, I knew that wasn't enough to explain it. I moved to the front door, my hand trembling on the doorknob. The quiet outside pressed against the cabin, thick and suffocating, but I had to know. I had to see if someone was out there. If the sound was real, if it wasn't just my nerves running wild. The door creaked open, and I stepped out into the cool air. The night enveloped me, cold and dark, as I walked cautiously toward the river's edge. The air was thick with moisture, and every step I took seemed to echo in the emptiness. The world felt stretched thin, and my skin prickled as if the air itself was watching me. The river lay before me, silent again. I could hear nothing now, nothing except my own breath and the soft rustle of the trees. The splashing had stopped, but my mind raced, still replaying the footsteps I'd heard moments before. I leaned forward, peering at the water, half expecting something, or someone, to rise from the depths. But nothing came. The river remained still. My heart pounded in my chest, and doubt began to creep in. Had I really heard it? Had it been just my imagination, playing tricks on me in the dark? Or had someone, or something, been out there? I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned and walked back to the cabin, my footsteps too loud in the stillness. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I locked it again, this time with a nervous urgency. Inside, I stood in the center of the room, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The sounds, the footsteps. They had been real, hadn't they? I glanced at the window again, my eyes darting to the river. The surface was as smooth and dark as ever, but now it seemed even more sinister. The unease had deepened, twisting into something darker, more primal. Something was out there, I was sure of it. Something that had no place on this earth. And as I stood there, staring at the river that seemed to hide its secrets in the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me. The next morning, the sun was a welcome relief from the night's oppressive silence. The cool light filtered through the trees, and the once intimidating river now looked serene, almost inviting. But something in the pit of my stomach told me the peace was fleeting. I couldn't shake the feeling that the night had left something behind, something I couldn't explain. I had decided to take a walk into the nearby town to clear my head. The air was still fresh, and the smell of pine filled my lungs as I wandered down the dirt road that led to a small general store. The town was as small as I had imagined, just a handful of old buildings and a couple of scattered houses. It felt like a place stuck in time, where nothing changed, where life moved slowly. I stepped into the store, greeted by the jingle of the doorbell. A man behind the counter, probably in his 60s, looked up from his newspaper. He had a weathered face, his eyes sharp, though his smile was warm. "Well, howdy there," he said, his voice deep with the accent that was so familiar, yet so foreign. "What brings you to these parts?" I returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach my eyes. "Just passing through," I said, my voice a little too light. "Needed to get out of the city for a bit." He nodded knowingly, folding his paper. "I can't say I blame you. Folks around here like their peace and quiet. But don't stay too long if you can help it." I raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" The man's gaze shifted toward the window, and for a moment it seemed like he was staring past me, into the distance. When he spoke again, his voice dropped low, as if sharing a secret. "The river's got a way of keeping people," he said, his tone serious. "Not everyone who stays around here leaves the same way they came. I frowned, confused. What do you mean? Is the river dangerous? He looked back at me, his eyes darkening. Not dangerous in the way you might think. It's more like it has a pull. People hear things. Strange things, especially at night. Sometimes it's just the wind, but sometimes it's something else. I shifted uncomfortably, the memory of last night's sounds creeping back into my mind. What kind of things? The man's eyes narrowed, as though weighing whether to tell me more. Finally, he leaned forward slightly and spoke in a near whisper. They say the river's haunted. Ghosts, if you believe in such things. People who wander too close to the water at night, they hear footsteps, like someone's walking across the river. And sometimes they disappear. You won't see them again. No one knows where they go, but folks around here say it's the ghosts. The ones who never found their way back. I tried to laugh, to brush it off, but the words stuck in my throat. The sound of footsteps on the water, the ones I had heard just the night before, came rushing back, clearer now, echoing in my mind. My stomach twisted, and I shifted on my feet, trying to appear unconcerned. Sounds like an old legend, I said, forcing a chuckle. I'm sure it's just superstition. The man didn't smile. His eyes remained fixed on mine, his expression grave. Maybe. But that river's been around longer than anyone can remember. And some things, they don't always have a good explanation. I nodded, uncomfortable but trying not to show it. I'll keep that in mind, I said, grabbing a bottle of water from the counter. Thanks for the tip. As I left the store, the man's words clung to me, heavy in the air. The river's ghosts. I could almost hear their footsteps again, distant but real. The idea that the river could be hiding something darker than just a stretch of water was unsettling, but I refused to believe in such things. Ghosts were just stories, after all. Superstition. But the unease from last night was still there, lingering like a shadow, and it was hard to shake off. Even as the sunlight bathed the town in warmth, a creeping coldness began to settle deep inside me, something I couldn't explain away. Something that told me I had only begun to scratch the surface of this place's secrets. That night, the air felt different, thicker, as if the world was holding its breath. The silence from the previous night had returned, but it was no longer comforting. It felt suffocating, like something was waiting, watching, listening. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on me with every passing hour. I couldn't shake the image of the man's face in the store, the way he had spoken about the ghosts of the river. I told myself it was just a story, an old local legend, but the sound of footsteps on the water, the same rhythmic splashing I had heard before, still echoed in my ears. It had come back, but this time it was different. The splashes were louder, faster, more deliberate. A growing crescendo, as if something was moving toward me across the river. I stood by the window, my hand pressed against the cool glass, staring into the blackness beyond. The river was quiet, but I could feel it, something was shifting. The water, once still and smooth, began to ripple, but not in the way it should. The ripples didn't follow the usual patterns. They moved in jagged, unnatural lines, like the water itself was being disturbed by something beneath the surface. The air seemed to hum with an unexplainable energy, a static charge that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't look away. The splashing grew louder, closer, more intense. The footsteps were no longer distant, they were right outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes searched the water, but there was nothing visible to explain the noise. No person, no animal, nothing. Just the same dark, undisturbed surface, reflecting the moonlight as if mocking my fear. The sound intensified, the rhythmic splashes now almost deafening. It was as though someone was walking across the water, each step falling heavily, pulling me closer to the edge of the river. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like a weight was pressing down on me. And yet, despite the paralyzing fear that coursed through me, despite every fiber of my being telling me to stay inside, something pushed me forward. I had to know. I had to see what was causing the noise, what was moving across the water. I couldn't stand being paralyzed by the unknown any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the night air cold and biting. My footsteps were too loud in the thick silence, echoing in the stillness. The river lay before me, darker than before, its surface now churning with unnerving, unnatural ripples. It was as if something was pulling the water, distorting it, shaping it in patterns I couldn't understand. I moved closer, the light of my flashlight dancing over the water's surface. I could hear the splashes now, clearly, unmistakably, as if the footsteps were just beyond the reach of the light, invisible but undeniably real. The sound was too perfect, too human, too deliberate to be anything but footsteps. I reached the edge of the river, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, the weight of fear so overwhelming it almost paralyzed me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my shaking hands as I shined the light across the water, trying to pierce the darkness. Nothing. The water moved in unsettling ways, but there was no figure, no shape, no sign of what was causing it. Just the ripples, the unnatural pattern, and the sound of footsteps, louder now, growing more desperate, more frantic. But still, nothing in sight. My breath quickened, and I felt my knees grow weak. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run back to the safety of the cabin, but I couldn't. The river, the water, was calling me, drawing me closer, and I couldn't understand why. I took another step forward, my foot almost touching the surface of the water, when the sound of footsteps suddenly stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, it was as though the world itself had gone still. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, listening. The air seemed heavier now, thick with something I couldn't name. Then, in the distance, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. It was as if the river itself was speaking to me, its voice indistinct but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. The sound wasn't just footsteps anymore, it was something else. Something that couldn't be explained. I looked into the dark water, the beam of my flashlight now trembling in my hand, but still, I saw nothing. I was being drawn in, pulled by something I couldn't see, something I couldn't understand. The air around me felt charged, alive, and every instinct in me screamed to turn away, to flee. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. I had come too close. And the river, whatever it was waiting. I woke to the soft warmth of the morning sun creeping through the cabin windows. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was, my mind clouded by an overwhelming sense of disorientation. My head ached as if I hadn't slept at all, and the feeling of unease clung to me like a fog that wouldn't lift. The silence in the cabin was deep, almost oppressive, and it took me a moment to remember the events of the previous night, the footsteps on the water, the ripples, the pull of the river. But nothing seemed to make sense anymore. As I sat up in bed, the memory of the fear, the inexplicable sounds, the haunting presence that had gripped me, all seemed distant, like a dream I couldn't quite grasp. The terror from the night before should have been fresh in my mind, sharp and clear, but it felt like a vague, fading shadow. My heart still raced with the echo of the fear, but the intensity had dulled, as if I were separated from it by an invisible barrier. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the heavy fog in my head, and stood up. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I made my way to the window, half expecting to see the river in turmoil again, to feel that same sense of impending danger hanging in the air. But the river looked calm. Too calm. The water stretched out before me, dark and still, mirroring the cloudless sky above. It was beautiful in its tranquility, almost serene. The ripples from last night, the unsettling footsteps, were gone, replaced by a silence that felt unnatural in its perfection. The air was fresh, crisp even, as if nothing had happened, as if the strange events of the night had been nothing but a figment of my imagination. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself. Maybe it had all been a dream. Maybe I had just imagined the sounds, convinced myself something was out there when there was nothing. But that didn't explain the unease still lingering in my chest, that nagging sensation that something was wrong. I hadn't dreamed the sounds. I hadn't imagined the feeling of being watched. And I certainly hadn't imagined the pull that had dragged me closer to the river, as if something had been calling to me. I stepped away from the window and moved to the kitchen, hoping the routine of making coffee would ground me, would chase away the unease. The cabin felt too quiet, too empty. The floorboards creaked under my weight, the sound hollow in the stillness. I fumbled with the coffee pot, my hands shaking ever so slightly, but the rational part of my mind told me I was just tired. I hadn't slept well. The isolation was getting to me. But the quiet, it was unnerving. There was a sense of stillness in the air that I couldn't explain, as if the world outside had stopped moving, holding its breath. Even the birds, usually so loud in the morning, had fallen silent. I glanced out the window again, and this time I could see the movement of the trees, their leaves shifting in the breeze. But the river, it was still. The only thing moving was the gentle sway of the grass along the bank. My thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of my phone ringing, sharp and startling in the quiet cabin. I jumped, my heart skipping a beat, and I quickly grabbed the phone from the table. It was a call from the city, a reminder that life beyond this place continued, untouched by the strange events of the past day. I answered, pushing the unsettling feelings to the back of my mind. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound normal, though the rasp in my voice betrayed the anxiety I couldn't shake. "Hey, it's me," came the voice of an old friend, cheerful as always. "How's the cabin? You getting settled in all right?" I forced a smile, relieved to hear something familiar. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just a little quiet. But it's nice, you know?" "You sure you're okay?" they asked, their tone shifting slightly. "You sound off. Like you're not really there." I paused, unsure how to respond. What could I say? That I heard footsteps on the water? That I felt like the river was alive with something I couldn't explain? I could hear my heartbeat thumping in my ears as I searched for the right words. "I'm just tired," I said finally, the words feeling empty even as they left my mouth. "I think the isolation is just getting to me. But I'm fine. Really." My friends seemed to accept that answer, though I could tell they weren't entirely convinced. "All right, well, just make sure you're taking care of yourself. Don't let yourself get too lonely out there." I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. "I will. Thanks." We said our goodbyes, and I hung up, setting the phone back down on the counter. A sense of unease settled over me again, heavier than before. My mind kept returning to the river, to the strange, inexplicable pull I had felt toward it. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I could feel it deep in my bones. I walked back to the window and stared at the water, the same dark surface staring back at me, unblinking, unyielding. The calmness was almost suffocating. I didn't trust it. The silence was a lie. The morning might have been bright, but the shadow of the river, the thing I couldn't name, still lingered in the corners of my mind, waiting, watching, always just beyond my grasp. The morning had passed without much change, the calm of the river still unsettling in its perfection. Yet, no matter how much I tried to convince myself that the night's terror had been nothing more than a product of my imagination, the unease remained. I could feel it gnawing at me, the way the silence in the cabin pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I told myself to take a walk, to clear my head. Maybe I just needed to step away from the cabin, from the river, and get some fresh air. But as I reached the door and stepped outside, a strange feeling washed over me, like something had shifted in the air, something invisible but real. I hesitated for a moment, a chill running down my spine, but then I forced myself to move, telling myself I was just being foolish. The grass was damp beneath my feet as I made my way toward the riverbank, the morning sun casting long shadows across the land. The river, still and silent, seemed to stretch endlessly before me. But there was something new, something I hadn't noticed before. Near the water's edge, partially hidden by a cluster of tall reeds, I spotted something unusual. At first, I thought it was just a patch of dirt disturbed by the wind, or maybe an old fallen branch. But as I moved closer, I realized it wasn't either of those things. A faint, irregular trail marked the earth, a series of shallow depressions in the dirt, almost like footprints, but they weren't human. They didn't follow any logical pattern, no clear direction, just random, uneven indentations as if something had dragged itself across the ground. And just beyond those, barely visible through the tall grass, was a symbol, a circle, drawn in the dirt, its edges faint but deliberate, the lines almost too perfect to be natural. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. My first thought was that it could be an animal's marking, some odd natural occurrence. But the more I looked at the circle, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just random. It felt deliberate, as if something had left it there. Something that wanted to be found. I crouched down, examining the symbol more closely. It wasn't just a simple shape. There were subtle, almost imperceptible markings within the circle, lines that curved and looped in ways that didn't seem to belong to any natural pattern I knew. My fingers hovered near the edge, an overwhelming urge to touch it rising in me. But I stopped myself, a warning flashing in the back of my mind. I didn't know what this was. I didn't know if I wanted to know. A feeling crept up on me then, an awareness, a presence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my senses heightened. It was the same sensation I'd felt last night by the river, only stronger now. I couldn't see anything, but I felt as though I were being watched, as though eyes were trained on me from the trees or the water itself. The wind had died down, and there was no sound except for the faint rustling of the reeds. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Nothing. But that didn't stop the prickling sensation crawling across my skin, the feeling that something was just beyond my reach, something waiting. My heart began to race. Shaking off the feeling, I stood up, stepping away from the symbol. I told myself it was nothing, just some animal or perhaps even another strange weather pattern. It didn't matter. I didn't want to make anything more of it than what it was. But even as I tried to reason with myself, a part of me couldn't let go of the thought that what I'd seen wasn't just random. Someone or something had left this here. I turned away and walked back to the cabin, my thoughts racing. The symbol, the strange trail, why had I noticed them? Why did it feel like I was being drawn toward them? I tried to shake it off, to brush it aside as a figment of my overactive imagination. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Maybe the silence of the river, the unnerving stillness, had begun to play tricks on my mind. But the more I tried to push it away, the more persistent the thought became. Something was watching me. Something had left that symbol on purpose, and it wasn't finished with me yet. Back inside the cabin, I tried to focus on the mundane. I sat at the table, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of it all. But no matter how I turned it over in my mind, the unease wouldn't go away. The symbol was still fresh in my mind, its odd shape lingering like a puzzle I couldn't solve. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just paranoid, that I had too much time on my hands to overthink it. But deep down, I knew something had changed. The air felt heavier, the silence more intense, as if the very land around me had shifted into something darker. I glanced toward the window, my gaze falling once again on the river. It was still, as it always was, but now it seemed to mock me. The quiet was no longer a comfort. It was a warning. The days that followed felt strangely disconnected. The weather had shifted slightly, a hint of fog clinging to the river at dawn, but the strange events of the past few days still clung to me. The unease was growing, each passing hour making the discomfort harder to ignore. The symbol by the river, the whisper of something watching me, it all had become a persistent thought that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just a river anymore, or the strange mark left in the dirt, it was everything. It was the way the shadows twisted at dusk, stretching longer than they should, as if they were reaching for me. It was the flickering of reflections in windows, not quite right, like something in the glass didn't belong. Sometimes, when I glanced over my shoulder, I would see a movement in the corner of my vision, just a shift, a subtle change in the air. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. At night, the cabin seemed to grow smaller, its walls pressing in on me, as though the darkness outside was creeping in. I started locking the doors earlier, drawing the curtains tight against the strange stillness of the world outside. I was more cautious now, hesitant to step outside after sunset, wary of what I might find lurking in the trees or just beyond the riverbank. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the air grew colder, I decided to walk into the nearby town to clear my head. I needed to escape the cabin, to talk to someone who could distract me from the endless swirl of paranoia building inside me. I made my way down the narrow road leading to the small local diner, the one place in town that seemed to always be open. As I entered, the warm air of the diner hit me, a welcome relief from the chill outside. The bell above the door chimed softly, and I walked to the counter, taking a seat on one of the stools. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, smiled as she approached. "Evening," she said, her voice warm but carrying a note of weariness. "What can I get you?" I ordered a coffee, my mind preoccupied with the strange things I'd been experiencing. As I waited, I glanced around, noticing a couple of local men sitting in the corner, talking in hushed tones. Their conversation paused as I walked in, and they turned to look at me briefly before going back to their low murmurs. Something about their glance unsettled me, as if they knew something I didn't. The waitress placed the coffee in front of me, and I smiled gratefully. She lingered for a moment, her gaze shifting to the door, then back to me. "You're staying out by the river, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft, almost casual. I nodded, suddenly uncomfortable under her gaze. Yeah, that's right. She gave me a tight smile, her eyes flickering to the two men in the corner. Well, you be careful out there, she said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. Not everyone likes to be reminded that the river's got secrets. You won't be the first one to feel its pull. Her words were so subtle, so offhand, but they sent a chill through me. Secrets? The river? What did she mean? I tried to dismiss it as local superstition, but the tone of her voice, the way she avoided looking at me directly, made me feel like she knew something I didn't. Are you saying something's wrong with the river? I asked before I could stop myself, the question hanging in the air between us. The waitress hesitated, her eyes darting to the men in the corner again, and then quickly back to me. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. It's not the river that's the problem. It's what's in it. You'd be wise to leave that place alone after dark. The words echoed in my mind, the weight of them settling like a stone in my stomach. Leave the river alone? What was she talking about? And why did it feel like there was something she wasn't saying? Before I could press her further, the men in the corner stood up, walking toward the door. One of them, a tall man with a gruff face, gave me a long look as he passed. His eyes were cold, but there was something else in them, a quiet warning. My breath caught in my chest as he lingered just a moment too long, his gaze sharp and knowing. Best be careful out there, he muttered as he walked by, his voice low, barely audible, but the intent clear. I watched him leave, my mind spinning. What did he mean? And why did everyone seem to think I was in danger? I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew something about the river, about whatever I had been feeling, and they weren't telling me. The waitress returned to her work without another word, but I could still feel her eyes on me as I sipped my coffee, trying to calm my racing thoughts. After finishing my drink, I paid the bill and left the diner, stepping back into the cool evening air. The shadows were long now, stretching across the road as the sun dipped lower behind the trees. The street lamps flickered on, casting an eerie glow over the empty streets. As I walked back to the cabin, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled again, that familiar feeling of being watched creeping up my spine. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder more often than I usually would, but saw nothing out of place. Just the quiet, the emptiness of the town, and the slow, steady whisper of the wind. By the time I reached the cabin, the night had fully settled in, the moon hanging high in the sky like a cold, distant eye. I paused at the door, a shiver running through me. The quiet was oppressive, but it wasn't the usual quiet I had grown accustomed to. It was different now, filled with something I couldn't define, something watching from the shadows. I felt it in my bones. When I stepped inside, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, my pulse quickening. But no matter how much I tried to shake off the feeling, I couldn't ignore it. I wasn't alone. Something was here with me. Something that had been waiting. The days began to blur into each other, the unsettling atmosphere of the cabin growing heavier with every passing hour. It was as though time had slowed, stretching out the unease until it became all-consuming. I couldn't remember the last time I'd slept through the night without waking in a cold sweat, heart pounding, terrified of what might be lurking just outside the cabin. The sounds had gotten worse. It started as whispers, just barely audible at first, like a soft rustling of leaves or the occasional splash of water. But now, they were unmistakable footsteps. Footsteps on the water, loud and distinct, as though someone or something was walking across the river's surface. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the wind, or the way the ripples in the water sounded when the current shifted. But no, this was different. The footsteps weren't random. They followed a steady, deliberate rhythm, like something was moving intentionally, step by step, through the dark water. Every night, they grew louder. Each night, they came closer. I couldn't ignore them anymore. The sound of those footsteps, coming from the direction of the river, had become an inescapable part of the night. No matter where I was in the cabin, no matter how tightly I shut the windows or how deeply I buried myself under the covers, the footsteps followed me. They echoed in my mind, relentless, as if they were calling me, drawing me toward the water. And then it happened. One night, I found myself awake, staring into the dark room. I wasn't sure if I had heard something or if I had simply woken from the endless cycle of nightmares. But when I looked toward the window, I felt it, an overwhelming, invisible force that seemed to pull me. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something primal that told me I had to go outside, had to go to the river. I tried to fight it, tried to reason with myself. But the pull was too strong. My body moved on its own, like I was no longer in control. My feet carried me toward the door before I even realized it, the cold air rushing into the room as I stepped outside. The footsteps were louder now, unmistakable. There was no mistaking them. They were no longer distant murmurs. They were right there, just beyond the edge of the river, the sound of wet feet slapping against the surface of the water. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my eyes scanning the darkness. I couldn't see anything, only the swirling blackness of the river, its surface calm but somehow ominous. The air was thick with tension, the world around me silent except for the steady beat of the footsteps. But then, through the trees, I saw it, a faint glow, a pale, ghostly light moving across the water. It flickered like a distant lantern, but there was no boat, no figure holding a light. The glow danced on the water's surface, twisting and turning with the current as if it were alive, following the rhythm of the footsteps. I took a step forward, and that was all it took. The force, that strange pull, intensified. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was physical. It tugged at my chest, my mind, pulling me toward the river as if the water itself were calling me. I fought it, forcing my legs to stop moving, but it was no use. I couldn't resist. I felt my feet move forward once more, as though they were no longer my own. The glow in the water flickered again, brighter this time, casting an eerie light across the ripples. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped closer to the water, the footsteps growing louder in the darkness, now only feet away. A cold gust of wind rushed past me, and the sound of the water's current grew stronger, as if something was rising beneath the surface. I reached the edge of the river, the water lapping at my shoes. The glow in the distance had grown into a clear shape now, something standing just beyond the bank. I couldn't make out any features, only the silhouette of a figure standing motionless in the dark water. It was impossible to tell if it was human or something else entirely. I reached out, trembling, as the figure began to move. It glided effortlessly over the surface of the water, stepping closer to me with every passing moment. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. The footsteps grew louder, the figure closer, until I could feel its presence beside me, like an ice-cold breath against my skin. And then, it stopped. The water was still again, and the figure, whatever it was gone. I stood there, breathless, heart racing, staring into the blackness of the river. My body trembled, a deep, gnawing fear settling deep within me. What had I just seen? What had just happened? The pull, that strange force, was still there, faint but persistent, urging me to step into the water. But I knew, no, I felt that I couldn't. I couldn't give in. Not now. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the river, and made my way back to the cabin, my legs shaky, my mind spinning. But the footsteps still echoed in my head, and I knew, without a doubt, that whatever was out there, whatever had just pulled me toward the water, wasn't finished with me yet. The worst part was, I wasn't sure I could escape it. The night I would never forget arrived with an oppressive stillness, a quiet so deep it seemed to swallow the very air around me. I had stayed up late, sitting in the corner of the cabin, too anxious to sleep but too terrified to go outside. The pull toward the river had become almost unbearable, a constant whisper in my mind, urging me to return to the water. The footsteps still echoed, growing louder with each passing moment, but I resisted. I wasn't ready to face it, not yet. But as the moon hung low in the sky, casting a faint glow over the trees, a new sensation gripped me. The air had grown colder, unnaturally so, and a heavy weight settled in my chest. I was being watched. It wasn't just the usual feeling of being followed, it was as if something, or someone, was standing just outside the cabin, waiting. The silence pressed in on me, louder than the footsteps I had heard before, like the entire world had paused for a breath. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something inside me snapped, and I rose from my seat, my body moving of its own accord, just like before. I knew I couldn't fight the pull anymore. The river called to me. With each step I took outside, the weight of the world seemed to shift. The night wrapped itself around me, thick and suffocating, as though the very darkness was alive, waiting for me to fall into it. I walked to the edge of the river, the sound of my feet crunching on the gravel the only noise in the stillness. The footsteps on the water had stopped, but the sense of presence had never been stronger. And then, I saw them. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow moving across the water. But as I strained my eyes, they became clearer. Figures. Phantom figures walking across the surface of the river, their bodies translucent, glowing faintly in the moonlight. They moved with eerie grace, their feet not sinking into the water but stepping lightly over it, as if the surface had no substance. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The legends, the stories I had dismissed as mere superstition, were true. These were the river ghosts, the spirits that haunted the waters at night. The very creatures I had felt in my bones, the ones that had been drawing me closer with every passing night. I watched as the figures moved toward me, their footsteps echoing in the quiet like a drumbeat, a rhythm that resonated deep within my chest. There were no faces, just vague outlines, shadowy and indistinct. Yet their presence was overwhelming, as if they were not merely apparitions, but something far more real, something far more dangerous. A cold wind whipped through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. I tried to turn, to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. Fear had paralyzed me, a deep, suffocating terror that made it impossible to move. The river's surface rippled as the ghosts approached, their movements synchronized in a way that felt deliberate. They were coming for me. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath, trying to understand what was happening. My mind raced. How could this be real? How could these creatures be walking on water? Everything I thought I knew about the world, about reality, was being shattered right before my eyes. The line between the natural and the supernatural had blurred, and I was standing in the midst of it. The first ghost reached the shore. It moved with slow, deliberate steps, its form flickering in and out of focus like a mirage. It extended a hand toward me, its fingers long and translucent, like ripples in the air. The touch was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt. It reached for my chest, but I couldn't move, couldn't pull away. I felt its touch deep within me, like it was pulling at my very soul, an overwhelming sense of dread flooding my mind. Then, another figure stepped closer. And another. They surrounded me, their presence pressing on me from all sides. Their footsteps no longer echoed, they reverberated through my body, vibrating the very ground beneath my feet. "Leave," one of the figures whispered, its voice a low, hollow echo, like the sound of wind through dead branches. The voice was everywhere, inside my head, my chest, my bones. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Panic surged through me, and I finally managed to move, but only to stagger backward, away from the river, my legs trembling beneath me. I could feel the pull of the river, stronger now, desperate, like the water itself was reaching for me. Another figure stepped closer, its form coalescing into something more solid, its outline becoming sharper. Its face, a distorted, hollow thing, came into focus, its eyes black and empty, staring at me with an unnatural intensity. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped in its gaze. The voices echoed in my mind again, "Leave. You should not be here." I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach. The realization hit me like a wave, crashing over me with a brutal force. The ghosts weren't just specters, they were the lost souls of those who had been pulled into the river, trapped in its depths for eternity. They were seeking something. They were seeking me. With every ounce of strength, I broke free from their gaze, stumbling away from the river, my heart pounding in my chest. The ghosts didn't chase me, but their presence followed, lingering in the air, suffocating, relentless. I ran, blind with terror, back to the cabin. The sounds of footsteps on water grew louder in my ears, like they were following me, never relenting. I didn't dare look back as I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. The cold had followed me inside. The air felt thick with it, oppressive and unnatural. My heart raced, but as I glanced out the window, I saw the river once more. It was still, unbroken. Yet the image of the ghosts, their hollow faces, their cold touch, was burned into my mind. The legends were true, and they had just begun to claim me. The next morning came with an eerie stillness, the kind that follows a nightmare, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I woke with a start, my chest tight, a cold sweat sticking to my skin. The memories of the night before, the ghosts, the water, the voices, clung to me like a second skin. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the fear that still rippled through my mind. I had to leave. I knew that much. This place was no longer safe. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, the walls closing in on me with every passing hour. The river called to me, a steady hum in the back of my mind, and I knew that if I stayed, it would only get worse. But the thought of leaving, of walking away from the very thing that had ensnared me, seemed impossible. It was as if something was holding me here, keeping me rooted to this cursed place. I packed quickly, tossing my belongings into a bag, my movements frantic and jerky. The air was thick, heavy with an almost oppressive silence. The river outside seemed to watch me, the water still and unbroken, like a mirror reflecting my every move. The pull, that invisible thread I had felt the night before, was stronger now, an undeniable force tugging at my chest. I tried to ignore it, trying to focus on the task at hand, but the sensation only grew more intense. Every step I took toward the door felt like a battle against some unseen force, as if the very air around me had thickened, wrapping itself around my limbs, pulling me back. My breath quickened, and my heart pounded in my chest. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle. The world outside was still, unnervingly so. The trees stood motionless, the leaves not even rustling in the breeze. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the river. The footsteps, the figures, the presence of the ghosts, they were all in my mind now, lingering, waiting. But I had to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. With a deep breath, I pulled the door open, stepping out onto the porch. The air was cool, but it felt thick with something else, something darker. My feet moved against my will, drawn toward the edge of the river, where the water waited, calm and silent. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't stop myself. Each step felt like a struggle. The pull was unbearable now, as if the river itself had reached out with unseen hands and was dragging me toward it. The earth beneath my feet felt unstable, like it was shifting beneath me, making it harder to walk. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, to run, but my legs moved forward, one step after another, against my will. I reached the water's edge, the river stretching before me like a vast, dark expanse. The surface was smooth, reflecting the sky above, but something about it felt wrong. There was an energy there, a force that I couldn't see but could feel deep in my bones. It wasn't just a pull, it was the sense of inevitability, the knowledge that I couldn't escape it. I stopped, standing at the edge, my heart hammering in my chest. The water lapped at the shore, its sound like a low whisper, beckoning me closer. There was no turning back now. The river had already claimed me, and I could feel it deep inside. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, but it was colder than it should have been, carrying with it a chill that sank straight to my bones. I glanced behind me, my gaze darting back to the cabin. It looked so small from this distance, so insignificant against the vast expanse of the river. But even though I was so close to leaving, so close to escaping, I knew the truth. I was trapped. The river wasn't just a body of water, it was a force, a living thing, and it had no intention of letting me go. The longer I stood here, the more I felt it tightening its grip on me, like an invisible thread wrapped around my chest, pulling me toward the center of the water. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled in my mind, but it was no use. The river was calling me, its pull undeniable. The more I resisted, the stronger it became. I could feel the weight of it, the pressure of the water beneath the surface, as if the very current was alive, waiting to draw me in. My breath caught in my throat as a figure appeared at the far end of the river, barely visible through the haze of fog that had started to roll in. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, as if walking toward me on the surface of the water. I couldn't look away. The figure came closer, its shape growing more distinct with each step. It was a person, or at least, it looked like one. But there was something wrong, something unnatural about the way it moved. The figure seemed to glide across the water, its feet never touching the surface, moving with a fluidity that was both beautiful and terrifying. I felt my pulse quicken, the dread in my chest growing heavier with every passing second. The figure was almost here. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was then that I realized the truth. The river wasn't just holding me here, it was feeding on my fear. The more I struggled, the more it pulled at me. And I could already feel the invisible thread wrapping tighter, drawing me closer to the water's edge. I turned to run, but my body refused to obey. My legs felt like lead, my mind clouded with panic. The figure was almost upon me now, its form solidifying, its face becoming clear in the fog. It was one of them, the river ghost, the phantom that had haunted my nightmares. It reached out toward me, its long, bony fingers stretching as if to take me. My heart stopped. I couldn't fight it anymore. The world had begun to unravel, like the threads of a dream slipping through my fingers. The moment I tried to turn away from the river, to escape the pull that had sunk its claws into my chest, I realized something worse than terror. It was as if the very air around me had thickened, becoming heavier, more suffocating with each breath I took. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the distant rustling of the trees and the water's whisper. I stumbled backward, fighting against the invisible force that tugged me forward, but the ground beneath my feet felt like it was shifting, the earth itself twisting as if trying to draw me closer to the river. My legs felt like they were made of lead, each step heavier than the last. The path back to the cabin, the one that had seemed so clear, so familiar, was now obscured, distorted by an overwhelming haze. I couldn't see straight, my vision blurred as though I were looking through water. I tried to focus, to steady myself, but my body betrayed me. Every inch I moved in the opposite direction was met with an equal force, like the river was pushing me, pulling me toward it with a power I couldn't fight. My feet dug into the ground, but it was no use. The invisible thread wrapped tighter around me, and the closer I got to the edge, the more I felt my control slip away. A disorienting ripple ran through the air, distorting everything in sight. The trees around me twisted and bent, their shapes warping into grotesque, unnatural forms. The world was beginning to fold in on itself, the lines of reality blurring into something unrecognizable. The fog had thickened, swirling in strange, impossible patterns, as though the very fabric of the world was being stretched and contorted. And yet, despite the disorienting shift in my surroundings, I couldn't stop moving forward. My mind raced, desperately trying to grasp hold of any rational explanation for what was happening. It's just a fear, I told myself. It's just your imagination playing tricks on you. But even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. They had no power, no weight. The pull of the river was too strong, too real. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut as if I could block out the nightmare that was unfolding around me. But even in the darkness, I could still hear the river, its whispers growing louder. The footsteps from the water. The faint echo of figures walking on the surface, drawing nearer. I could feel them, feel their presence, just beyond the veil of the fog. Opening my eyes again, I saw the figure, clearer now, closer. The spectral figure moved across the water with a fluidity that defied everything I knew. It was not walking, it was gliding, as if the river itself was cradling it, lifting it from below. The face was hazy, a shadow of what it might have once been, but the eyes, they were empty, hollow, void, staring directly at me. I gasped, my body freezing as the figure moved closer. The river had already claimed its first victim. Could it be after me now? The fear swelled inside me, an all-encompassing terror that gripped my chest, making it hard to breathe, to think. The very air seemed to hum with energy, vibrating in sync with the rhythm of the ghostly footsteps. I turned again, trying to find the strength to move, to escape, but the ground had begun to sink beneath me. The dirt shifted and churned, the earth trembling as if the river's force was slowly pulling it into its depths. I felt myself being dragged, my feet unwillingly sliding toward the water, the invisible pull growing stronger with each passing second. I had to escape. I had to break free. But with every attempt, the world around me seemed to distort further, until the very landscape had become unrecognizable. The trees were bent at impossible angles, the sky a sickly yellow hue, swirling with dark clouds that churned as if in anger. Nothing was real anymore. The world was becoming a twisted version of itself, and the only constant was the river, the cold, endless river that called me, that pulled me. My breath was coming in short gasps now, my thoughts fragmented as I tried to focus, to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. It had to be an illusion, a product of my mind breaking under the strain of fear. But the more I tried to rationalize, the more real everything became. The pull didn't stop. The distortions didn't cease. I was slipping deeper into something I couldn't control, something beyond my comprehension. I reached for the trees, my fingers grasping at the bark, trying to steady myself, to find something solid. But it slipped away. The ground beneath me twisted and shifted, like sand flowing through my fingers, and I was falling into something far darker than I could have imagined. The figure on the water reached the shore, its face now coming into sharp focus. It was no longer a mere shadow, it was something else entirely. A body, a face, empty eyes staring at me, unblinking, as if they were waiting for me to understand. "Leave now," the figure whispered, its voice a hollow sound that reverberated through my mind. "You belong to the river now." I closed my eyes, but the voice echoed in my head, louder, sharper than before. I shook my head violently, but I could not break free. The river had already claimed me. There was no going back. I was no longer standing on solid ground. The pull had become an unbearable force, a weight that dragged me downward, pulling me into the water. This is it. The thought crashed through my mind, cold and final. There was no escape. The river was taking me. The water lapped at my ankles, the cold creeping up my legs, pulling me deeper into its embrace. It wasn't just a pull anymore. It was the weight of the water, the heavy force that seemed to drag me down, urging me into its depths. My body trembled, but I fought to stay upright, to hold on to whatever fragile sense of control I had left. I had to understand. I had to know who these ghosts were, why they were here, and what the river wanted from me. If there was any chance of escape, it was only by confronting this nightmare head-on. With each step into the water, the temperature dropped and the air grew heavier. The fog had thickened to a suffocating level, surrounding me like a dense veil. I couldn't see beyond it, but I felt them, the ones who had walked before me. The river ghosts. The first figure appeared like a shadow, a faint distortion in the fog. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I had been teetering on the edge of madness for what felt like an eternity. But the figure grew clearer, its outline sharpening until I could see it for what it truly was. A woman, drenched in dark water, her face pale and gaunt. Her clothes clung to her, sodden, the fabric heavy as though it had been submerged for years. She glided toward me, her feet never touching the water, her movements unnaturally fluid. Her eyes locked onto mine, empty sockets staring with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Why are you here?" Her voice came as a whisper, yet it felt like it reverberated through my skull, a low, mournful sound. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat was tight, choked by the terror that flooded my chest. I could only stare at her, at them, waiting for some kind of explanation. Another figure appeared beside her, this one a man, his face obscured by long, wet hair. He, too, seemed more real than I had anticipated, his features sharp, his expression filled with an unsettling sorrow. His hands reached out, but they stopped just short of touching me, hovering in the cold air like they were being restrained by an invisible force. "Please, leave," he murmured, his voice breaking with a desperate edge. "It's too late for us. You can't escape it." The woman nodded, her eyes now filled with a strange sadness. "We never could. The river, it holds us. It pulls us under, and once you've felt its call, it never lets go. It's too late for all of us." Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice hoarse. "What do you want from me?" The man's lips trembled, as if he struggled to find the right words. His gaze flicked nervously to the river, as though he feared something lurking just beneath the surface. "We were once like you. Alive. We came here thinking we could escape. But the river, it doesn't let anyone leave. We're trapped here, wandering, lost." His hands trembled, and the woman's face contorted in pain. "We were foolish. We thought it was just a legend. The river doesn't forgive. It never forgets." I stepped back, my feet sinking deeper into the water, but I couldn't stop myself. The pull, the pressure, was so overwhelming. It was like I was being drawn into the river's depths. The ghosts watched me, their expressions filled with pity, fear, and regret. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice rising, panic creeping in. "Why show me this?" The woman's lips parted slightly, and for a moment it looked like she was about to say something else. But then her eyes turned distant, as though she was remembering something long past. "We have to warn you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rush of the river. "You have no choice now. You are already part of it. The river has claimed you, and you will walk its waters just like we did. You are lost." I shook my head, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "No. I can't be. I won't." The man reached out to touch my arm, his fingers cold and wet, but I jerked away, stumbling backward. He didn't seem to notice my fear. His face twisted in something like longing, as though he wished he could offer me a way out, but knew better. "You can't fight it. You'll never leave." His voice was filled with the weight of years, of endless wandering. "There is no escaping the river. It will take you, and it will hold you here until you become like us." The words were a cold slap to my face. The realization, that terrifying truth, washed over me like a wave. This was it. I was already too far gone. The woman's form flickered, her edges growing blurry, like a mirage fading before my eyes. "Don't fight it," she said softly, her voice growing distant. "We couldn't. You shouldn't. Just accept it." I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my breath ragged as I struggled to understand what had just happened. These were the ghosts of the river, souls trapped by the curse, forever bound to walk the water's surface, never able to escape. And now, I was one of them. But the worst part wasn't the realization. It was the way they looked at me, like I was just another lost soul, another victim of the river's endless hunger. I had thought I was fighting for my life, but now I wasn't so sure. The line between the living and the dead had blurred. I was slipping. "Please," I whispered, my voice shaking, "I don't want this." But the river didn't care. It had claimed me, just like it had claimed them. There was no turning back. The pull grew stronger. The figures, the ghosts, disappeared into the mist, their faces fading into the fog. Their words lingered in my mind, but their presence was gone. And still, the river pulled. I stood at the edge of the river, my mind reeling with the revelations the ghosts had shared. The words echoed in my head, "You're already part of it. The river has claimed you." My body trembled as I fought to make sense of it all, but the truth had settled in my bones, cold and unyielding. The river was not just a body of water. It was a force, ancient, powerful, and unforgiving. It consumed, it trapped, and it left nothing in its wake but sorrow and despair. The fog had thickened, swirling around me like a cloak. I needed answers. I had to understand more about what I was dealing with before it was too late. My mind couldn't accept the idea that I was already lost, that my fate was sealed. There had to be a way to break free, a way to fight back against whatever dark force ruled this cursed river. I turned from the water, my feet heavy as I walked back toward the cabin. The air around me was thick with tension, and each step felt like a battle against an invisible force. The whispers of the river seemed to follow me, taunting me with their promises of fate and inevitability. "You cannot escape." The words were no longer just from the ghosts. They seemed to come from the very river itself, seeping into my mind, binding me to it. I found an old book in the cabin, dusty and worn, its pages yellowed with age. It was hidden beneath a pile of papers on the desk, probably left behind by whoever had lived here before me. As I flipped through the pages, the smell of old paper filled the air, and the weight of the words seemed to press down on me. It was a journal, a local history, of sorts. As I skimmed through the pages, I began to piece together the history of the river and its hauntings. The river was older than the town, older than the people who lived here. It had been here long before anyone dared to settle along its banks. And according to the journal, it had always been different. People had always disappeared in this place, wanderers, settlers, travelers who never returned. The townsfolk had their stories, their superstitions. They whispered of a curse, a force that dwelled beneath the water, a power that took souls and bound them to the river for eternity. The more I read, the more I felt a chill in the air, a sense of foreboding that grew stronger with each passing word. I learned that the river's hauntings had not been isolated events. No, they were part of something much older. Generations of people had vanished into its depths, and each one had left behind only whispers, rumors, and half-forgotten memories. The journal spoke of a ritual, an ancient pact, sealed in blood long before anyone knew what it truly meant. The river was a living thing, a powerful entity that fed on the souls of the lost. And once a soul had been claimed, it would never be freed. The river would take it, drown it, and then make it walk its waters, forever between the banks, never able to return home, never able to rest. The curse, I realized with growing horror, was not just some myth. It was real. And the only way to escape it was to break the hold the river had on you, but no one had ever done that. The ghosts I had seen, the souls trapped between life and death, were proof of the river's power. They were the ones who had tried to escape, who had failed. I couldn't help but feel a sickening sense of dread creeping into my bones. The river had claimed them. It had claimed me, too. I had felt it, the pull, the weight of its force. It was too strong to fight, too overwhelming to escape. There was no going back. As I turned another page in the journal, my hand froze. There, in the margins, was something more recent, almost as if someone had written it just days ago. It was a warning. The river doesn't let you go. Once it has claimed you, it never lets go. But there is a way. There is always a way. If you can find it. I reread the words, my pulse quickening. The sentence was written in a hasty scrawl, the ink smeared in places as though the person had been in a hurry. I read it again, as if I could pull something more from the cryptic warning, but the rest of the page was blank. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope in me. There's a way. There is always a way. But the question remained, what was it? What could possibly break the river's curse? I didn't have the answer. Not yet. But I knew one thing for sure, the river was not going to let me leave without a fight. It was more than a body of water. It was a force of nature, a curse older than time itself. And if I couldn't figure out how to break it, I would become just another lost soul, trapped forever between the banks. The air around me felt heavy now, like a storm was brewing. The river seemed to pulse, its current picking up strength as if it knew I was looking for a way out. I could feel the water's pull, like an invisible thread wrapped around me, tightening with every passing second. I have to find it, I thought desperately, whatever it is. Whatever the way is. Before it's too late. But even as I thought the words, I knew the truth, time was running out. The river was growing stronger. And the longer I stayed, the more I felt its grip on me tightening. I had to make a decision. Fight for my life, or surrender to the river and become another lost soul. I had no memory of how it happened. One moment, I was standing in the cabin, desperately searching for answers, and the next, I was on the riverbank again. The air felt thicker, the weight of the fog pressing down on me. My limbs felt heavy, like I was moving through water, though I wasn't. It was as if I had been pulled here against my will. I looked down at the water, the same water that had haunted me for days now, but something had changed. The surface was still, almost too still, unnaturally calm. The river whispered its call, soft and insistent, like a mother calling her child. I wanted to resist, wanted to run, but my body didn't obey. The pull was too strong, too overpowering. I felt like a puppet, my strings controlled by some unseen hand. I stepped forward, my feet sinking into the soft earth beneath me, the cold water lapping at my ankles. A chill ran through my body, but I couldn't stop moving. It was as though the river itself was leading me, coaxing me to step deeper, to cross to the other side. With each step, I felt the coldness seep deeper into my skin. It wasn't just the water. It was the sense of inevitability, the unshakable knowledge that I was not in control. The ghosts had warned me. The river never lets you go. And now, I understood. The water wrapped around my legs, rising with each hesitant step I took, until it reached my waist, my chest. I could feel it pulling at me, tugging at my soul, like it was trying to drag me under. Panic gripped me, but I couldn't stop. My body moved as if it had been trained to follow the river's command. There was no resisting it. I glanced over my shoulder, the cabin now a distant silhouette through the thick fog. Everything felt wrong. I should have been running in the opposite direction, trying to escape this nightmare. But my body refused to listen to reason. The river was taking me across, whether I wanted it or not. The sensation of stepping further into the water was like stepping into a dream. The world around me began to blur, the fog swallowing everything, until there was nothing left but the water and the weight of my own thoughts. My heart pounded in my chest, but the sound of it seemed muffled, drowned out by the rushing of the water and the eerie silence of the night. I could barely breathe. I looked ahead, and for the first time, I saw the other side of the river. The far bank was cloaked in shadow, just beyond my reach. The path was unclear, shrouded in mist. But there was something there, something waiting for me. I couldn't make out its form, but I felt its presence as surely as I felt the cold water around me. As I moved closer, I heard the soft sound of footsteps on the water behind me, footsteps that didn't belong to me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was walking just behind me. The water rippled as though something was moving beneath the surface, just out of sight. I turned quickly, my heart racing. There was nothing there. The water was still. The sound of the footsteps faded into the quiet night. I felt a wave of confusion wash over me. Was I imagining it? Or was it the river playing its tricks, as it always did? But then, a cold hand brushed against the back of my neck. I gasped, spinning around, but again, there was nothing. Nothing but the empty, dark river and the shadows on the opposite bank. It wasn't the water. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel. A presence. A force that was watching me, waiting for me to cross. The river surged beneath me, and I stumbled forward, unable to stop. Each step felt like a step toward my fate, and with each step, the world around me grew darker, more distorted. The fog swallowed everything, until there was nothing left but the water and the feeling that I was being led somewhere I couldn't escape. The other side loomed ahead. The bank was closer now, the shadows on the far shore more distinct, more tangible. But I could feel the river's pull, its cold embrace, as if it was trying to keep me from reaching the shore. It wasn't just the water pulling at me. It was the river itself, its spirit, its curse, holding me in its grip. I reached out, my fingers grazing the cold edge of the far bank, but the moment my feet hit the ground, a violent surge of water pushed me back. I gasped, barely able to stay upright, my body rocked by the current. My feet slipped on the slick rocks, and for a terrifying moment, I thought the river would drag me under. But somehow, I managed to regain my footing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked back at the water, but there was nothing. The pull had stopped. The river seemed to calm, as if satisfied by its hold on me. But the damage was done. I had crossed. I had stepped into its world. I didn't remember how I had crossed the river, how I had ended up on the other side. My mind was foggy, like I had just woken from a deep sleep, a sleep that lasted for days or weeks. Time had no meaning here, on the banks of the river. The further I went, the more disoriented I became, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the river was still with me. As I stood there on the far side, I realized the truth. I wasn't in control anymore. I had crossed over, but I hadn't escaped. I had only stepped deeper into the river's grip, into its eternal hold. And now, I was trapped, forever walking between the banks of the river. Just like them. Just like the others. I woke with a start, my body cold, my clothes damp with the residual chill of the river. My eyes fluttered open, the darkness of the night still hanging thick in the air, but something was wrong. The world around me was off. I wasn't where I had been before, that much was clear. I sat up slowly, my head spinning, as if I had just woken from a deep, disorienting sleep. But it wasn't a peaceful sleep. It was more like a fall, one that I couldn't remember, but could feel in every ache of my limbs, every disjointed thought in my mind. The first thing I noticed was the silence. A thick, oppressive quiet that hung in the air like a weight, as if the very world itself had held its breath. There was no rustling of leaves, no animals scurrying in the underbrush, no distant sounds of the river flowing. Just stillness. I stood up, my legs shaky, and looked around. The landscape was familiar in a way, yet completely wrong. The trees were twisted in unnatural ways, their limbs reaching out like fingers, contorted as if caught in some unseen storm. The air smelled damp and earthy, but there was an underlying odor, something rotten, something that made my stomach churn. I couldn't place it. It was like the land was holding something back, something it didn't want me to see. The water, the river, was just behind me, its current eerily still, the surface reflecting nothing. The bank I had stepped onto seemed to stretch out endlessly, the fog clinging to the ground in strange, shifting patterns. The water was there, but it felt far away, as though it had receded from this world, leaving only its faint memory behind. The pull was still there, though. I could feel it deep in my chest, like an invisible thread wrapped around my heart. It was weaker now, but no less present. The river wanted me. It was still calling. I took a hesitant step forward, my body instinctively recoiling as if something was watching me, even though I saw no one. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches swaying in a wind I couldn't hear. The path before me seemed to stretch on forever, twisted and winding, as though it led somewhere far from where I had been. But the landscape had a warped quality to it, as though the very ground I walked on was shifting beneath my feet. The more I looked around, the more I felt a creeping sense of dread settle over me. The sky, which should have been dark and starless, hung low and bruised, a sickly shade of greenish gray. It felt like a half-forgotten dream, one that you couldn't shake, no matter how hard you tried. The world didn't feel right. Nothing felt right. I reached out to steady myself against one of the twisted trees, and as I did, I felt a strange shudder run through the ground. It wasn't an earthquake, there was no shaking, no tremor. It was something subtler. The earth beneath me seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, as if it had its own heartbeat, one that synced with the river's call. It was unnerving. I pulled my hand back, rubbing my fingers as though they had touched something cold and wet, though nothing was there. I tried to push the thoughts from my mind, focusing on the reality of the situation. I had crossed the river, somehow. But this wasn't the same place I had left behind. This wasn't the peaceful, if eerie, riverbank I had known. This was something else, something darker, twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend. The feeling that something was watching me only intensified. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure of someone or something lurking in the fog just beyond the reach of my sight. But there was nothing. Nothing but the silent, unmoving water, the twisted trees, and the suffocating atmosphere of the place. A sharp, sudden noise broke the silence, a crack, like the snap of a branch underfoot. I whirled around, my heart leaping in my chest, but again, there was no one. Nothing. My breath came faster now, my senses on edge. The silence that followed felt even more oppressive, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against me, suffocating me. I could feel the weight of the river on my mind, its pull, its influence still threading through my thoughts. There was no escape from it, not here, not in this twisted version of reality. It had followed me. I took a few cautious steps forward, trying to focus on what lay ahead. There had to be a way to break this curse, a way to get out. But the more I looked around, the more I felt as if I were sinking into some kind of distorted limbo, a place between worlds, between life and death. The river had taken me, and now it seemed to hold me in this strange, forgotten space where the rules of nature no longer applied. I paused, listening to the soft, unsettling lapping of the water. The pull was still there, drawing me back toward the river, back toward the haunting silence and the distorted landscape. Something about this place, The other side felt like a prison, a place from which there was no return. The river had claimed me, and I had crossed, but now I was lost in between. I was no longer sure if I was in the world I had known, or if I was somewhere else entirely, a place where the laws of time and space had been twisted beyond recognition. And all I knew for certain was that I was not alone here. The feeling of being watched never left me. It was in the trees, in the water, in the very air. Something was waiting, and it wouldn't let me leave. The world around me was no longer solid. It felt like I was walking through a dream that had slipped away from the edges of my memory. My feet moved, but it was as if I wasn't quite connected to them, as if I were floating just above the ground. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, dragging me deeper into the strange, twisting landscape. The fog clung to everything, veiling the world in a soft, suffocating blanket. I couldn't tell where the fog ended and the night began. It was all the same, thick, impenetrable, and unsettling. I glanced around, trying to steady myself, to make sense of what was happening. But the trees, those gnarled, crooked trees, seemed to bend and sway unnaturally, their twisted branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. They were alive, in a way, not just moving with the wind, but almost aware. I could have sworn I saw one of them shift, the bark warping slightly as if it were watching me. But when I blinked, it was still, as if nothing had happened. The air was damp and smelled faintly of decay, but there was also something else, something metallic, like blood. It clung to the back of my throat, making it hard to breathe, to think clearly. I had to keep moving, had to find my bearings, but the world around me refused to make sense. The path before me twisted and turned, stretching in impossible directions, looping back on itself like some cruel joke. I stumbled, my foot catching on a rock hidden beneath the thick fog, and I reached out to steady myself. My fingers brushed against the smooth surface of a stone, but when I pulled back, it wasn't a stone at all. It was something soft, something alive. I jerked my hand away in panic, my heart pounding. The world tilted again, my vision swimming, and I had to close my eyes to steady myself. When I opened them again, everything had changed. The trees had shifted positions. The path had grown narrower, more overgrown, as if time itself was warping. The fog seemed to pulse in and out, breathing like a living thing. I took a step forward, and the ground beneath me seemed to stretch out, pulling away just slightly before I could place my weight down. It felt as though the earth itself was moving, shifting with every step I took. I tried to calm myself, to tell myself it was just the stress, just my mind playing tricks on me, but that voice of reason grew fainter with each passing moment. How could I explain what was happening? The trees, those skeletal shapes, they weren't supposed to bend like that. The shadows, too. They were moving. I could see them, darting out from behind the trees and the rocks, flitting across the ground like living things, too fast for me to track with my eyes. I tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt wrong in my lungs, too thick, too oppressive. It made my chest tighten, and I could feel a cold sweat beginning to bead on my forehead. I wasn't just lost. I was disappearing into this place, slipping between worlds I didn't understand. I glanced up at the sky, hoping for some sign of reality. But the sky had changed, too. It was darker, but not in the way it should have been at night. The stars had all but vanished, swallowed up by a sickly, greenish-gray hue that stretched from horizon to horizon. The sun didn't rise here. It couldn't. It felt as if this place existed outside of time, trapped in an eternal twilight. I shook my head, trying to clear the haze of disorientation that clouded my thoughts. The pull of the river was still there, tugging at me, a constant undercurrent beneath everything. I couldn't escape it. It was like the river had followed me here, like it was embedded in the very fabric of this place, bending it to its will. I could hear it faintly in the distance, the soft lapping of water against stone, but it wasn't the same. It was distant, muffled, as though I were hearing it from a far-off place. I took another step, my feet dragging in the thick, shifting mist, but when I looked down, I noticed something strange. The shadows of my feet didn't match my movements. They moved before I did, stretching and twisting in strange angles. They weren't my own. They couldn't be. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My heart skipped a beat, the panic rising inside me like a wave. Is someone there? I whispered, my voice breaking the silence that had settled around me like a heavy cloak. But no one answered. There was no sound, no movement in the mist, except for the shadows. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind, just the disorientation of this strange place. I turned away, trying to focus on finding my way out, but it was impossible to know which direction to go. Every turn I took led me deeper into this distorted, dreamlike world. Nothing was as it should be. The trees stretched longer than they should have, their branches hanging lower and lower, as if to trap me in their embrace. The ground seemed to ripple, as though I were walking on the surface of water instead of solid earth. The air felt heavier now, pressing against me like an unseen weight. I could feel it in my chest, my lungs fighting for breath in the thick, oppressive atmosphere. My mind raced, trying to find any logical explanation for what was happening, but there was none. I couldn't understand it. I didn't want to understand it. In the distance, I thought I saw a figure, just a glimpse, fleeting and indistinct. But when I turned to face it, it vanished, leaving only the swirling fog behind. My heart raced. Was it one of the ghosts? Or was it something else? Something that had been waiting for me here? I took another step forward, my mind spinning, unsure of what was real and what was a product of my disoriented thoughts. The world shifted again, and I felt a sharp, pulling sensation in my chest, a tug toward the river. It was calling me, still. I couldn't escape it. I didn't know where I was anymore. I didn't know what was real. But I had to keep moving. I had to find my way out before whatever was following me caught up. I turned around, hoping to spot the familiar outline of the riverbank, the place where I had crossed just hours ago, or had it been days? Time had stopped making sense, and now all I could do was fight the overwhelming sensation that I was walking in circles, trapped in a loop that only deepened my confusion. The path before me was no longer the same as it had been moments ago. The trees, those same twisted shapes, now seemed to close in on me, their shadows stretching longer and darker than before. I thought I saw the river in the distance, a glimmer of moonlight reflecting off its surface, but when I pushed forward, the landscape shifted again. The mist swirled around me, pulling me in every direction. I couldn't tell if I had been here before or if I was in some distorted version of it, some mockery of the real world. The ground felt different now, soft and damp beneath my feet, not the hard earth I had walked on earlier. The fog seemed to twist in patterns that didn't belong in the natural world, like the very atmosphere itself was trying to disorient me, to keep me here. I stopped and looked around, my breathing shallow, panic rising. The landmarks, those familiar trees, the outcropping of rocks by the river, should have been comforting. They should have been signs that I was going in the right direction. But they weren't. They were wrong. The trees were bent in odd ways, their trunks gnarled and hollowed out in places that didn't make sense. The rock formations were out of place, not where I had remembered them. It was as though the landscape had been remade, its rules rewritten to keep me from ever finding my way back. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. No, this couldn't be happening. It was as if the world itself was changing, shifting its contours every time I looked away, like some cruel trick. The river was no longer visible, and all I could hear was the echo of water lapping against something unseen in the distance. My legs felt weak beneath me, and I sank to my knees in the soft, damp earth. I had to get out. I had to find my way back. But the more I tried to focus, the more I realized how impossible that was. Was this still the same place I had crossed to? I couldn't be sure. The river had felt so close earlier, but now it was as if it had slipped away from me entirely. I couldn't hear its current, couldn't feel its pull. And yet, I knew it was still there, waiting, somewhere just beyond the mist. But the more I searched for it, the more it seemed to evade me. It was mocking me, just out of reach, like a phantom that didn't want to be found. I stood again, more slowly this time, forcing my legs to obey. There had to be a way out. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't be lost forever in this twisted version of the world. But every step I took seemed to carry me further from my goal. Every tree, every stone, every patch of ground seemed wrong, like it was shifting just as I approached. I found myself walking in circles, retracing the same steps I thought I had already taken. The path ahead was the same as the one behind. I had seen this rock formation before. This particular tree. Why couldn't I find the way back? I sat down again, trying to focus. Breathe. In, out. I forced my hands to steady themselves as I wiped the sweat from my forehead. This was real. It had to be real. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had to calm down. But as I sat there, alone in the fog, it was hard to hold on to that thought. What if this wasn't a trick? What if I wasn't truly here, on solid ground? What if this place was just some reflection of my own mind, some fragment of reality that had been twisted beyond recognition? The thought was chilling. I had never been the kind of person to entertain fantasies, to give into irrational fears. But the longer I sat, the more the unease grew. Something was wrong here, something I couldn't explain. And as I glanced around once more, a sense of dread began to crawl up my spine. Was I dead? Was this some kind of purgatory? I shook my head violently. No. I couldn't think like that. I couldn't let myself believe it. I was alive. I had to be. But the more I looked around, the less certain I felt. The air was too thick. The world too distorted. The silence was suffocating, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. I was no longer sure if I was walking through a dream or if this place had somehow become my reality. The fog began to feel less like mist and more like something tangible, something alive, creeping into my lungs, suffocating me from the inside. I could feel it pushing at the edges of my mind, warping my thoughts. It was like I was losing myself, losing my grip on the world I had known. I stood up again, desperation pushing me forward. I had to try again. I had to break free, somehow. But with every step I took, the landscape refused to obey. The trees kept shifting. The fog kept thickening. It was as if the world itself was rejecting me, pushing me further away from the life I had known. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't lose myself. But as I pushed forward again, the world seemed to stretch, the ground beneath me becoming softer, more fluid. I looked down, my breath catching in my throat. The earth was no longer solid. It was water, dark, swirling water that had crept up around my feet, pulling me back toward the river. My mind screamed, but it didn't matter. The pull was there, relentless. It was dragging me again, back into its depths. I had no choice. I couldn't fight it anymore. The water was already at my ankles. It was time to face what had been waiting for me all along. The water pulled at my legs, cold and relentless, its currents beginning to drag me further into the river's grasp. Panic surged within me, but the terror of the river was nothing compared to what I felt when I saw them again, the ghosts. They appeared silently, slipping out from the mist, their translucent figures emerging from the water as if it were their domain, their home. I hadn't been able to escape them before, and now, as I tried to wade back toward the other side, they were here again, standing between me and freedom. Their faces were as hollow as the river itself, eyes dark pools of despair, their forms shifting in and out of focus like shadows cast upon the surface of the water. I tried to move, but the water around me grew deeper, and with it, the ghosts became more distinct, more real. Their presence was suffocating, cold, their whispers filled with a low hum that reverberated in my chest. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their voices layered, overlapping, like a distant echo of many souls in pain. I tried to turn, to find another way, but they surrounded me, their forms becoming sharper, more defined. And then I heard a voice that cut through the cacophony, a voice that was familiar, yet strange. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice said, low and haunting. None of us were. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribcage as the figure of a man materialized before me, his form less hazy than the others. His eyes were clouded with the same despair, but his face was something I could almost recognize. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, though the words felt like they were strangling me. He smiled, but it wasn't comforting. It was a sad, bitter smile, full of years, centuries, maybe longer. His clothes were tattered, his hair wild and unkempt, like he'd been here far longer than I had. He looked like someone who had once been like me. A traveler. A lost soul. "I was once a traveler, too," he said, his voice filled with the weight of ages. "I crossed the river, thinking I could leave. But there's no leaving. Not from here." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I staggered back, my knees threatening to give way under the weight of his revelation. "No, that can't be true. I'm alive. I was just on the other side." The ghosts began to move closer, surrounding me. Their figures were more solid now, their outlines sharper, and as they reached for me, I felt an icy chill seep into my bones, coldness that seemed to travel from the water and into my very soul. The man shook his head, his eyes sorrowful. "No, you were never meant to leave. The river claims those who are lost. Once you cross, there is no return. Not for the living, and certainly not for the dead." I tried to shake off his words, tried to hold on to the belief that this was just some nightmare, some twisted figment of my fear. But deep down, I knew he was right. The river had claimed me. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How long have you been here?" His face twisted in agony. "Longer than you can comprehend. I crossed when I thought the world on the other side was better, when I thought I was escaping something. But there is no escape from the river. It pulls you in. And once it does, you're here forever." The water swirled around me, pulling me deeper. I could feel it moving beneath me, trying to drag me into the cold depths. I wanted to fight back, but my body refused to move, as though the very air around me was holding me in place. The ghosts were closing in, their faces twisted in eternal anguish, their hands reaching for me, as if to drag me into the darkness that lay beneath the surface. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thicker, as though it was suffocating me, tightening around my chest with every passing second. The man's face grew distant, his eyes filled with hopelessness. "You have to accept it," he whispered. "You're one of us now, trapped in this place between life and death. There's no going back." The reality of his words hit me like a wave crashing down. I had crossed, and now I was trapped. There was no way back. The river had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others. And like them, I would wander forever, caught between worlds, unable to escape. But then something inside me snapped. The terror, the hopelessness. It all twisted into something darker, something more primal. "No!" I screamed, my voice breaking through the fog. "I refuse. I refuse to be trapped here with you. I don't belong here." But the ghosts only circled closer, their whispers rising, becoming more frantic. Their faces were filled with despair, but also something else, something I couldn't quite place. It was as if they were trying to warn me, trying to make me understand what I had done. The man's eyes met mine, filled with the weight of centuries of suffering. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking with the weight of his eternity. "You are already dead. The river has claimed you. There is no way back. You are one of us now." I shook my head violently, trying to fight the realization that was creeping into my mind. But it was there, in the hollow of my chest, the cold truth that I couldn't escape. I was trapped. The river had claimed me. And now I was one of the lost souls that wandered its cursed banks, forever bound to the water's will. As I felt myself begin to fade, as the water swirled higher around me, the last thing I saw was the ghost's face, twisted in agony. It was a reflection of what I was to become. The water closed over my head, and I was lost. The cold grasp of the water tightened around me, each wave dragging me deeper into its dark embrace. The ghostly figures, their eyes hollow and mournful, pressed in closer, their hands reaching out, their whispers filled with sorrowful warnings. Their touch was like ice, seeping into my skin, into my soul, as if they were trying to pull me into the very heart of the river. But somewhere, deep within me, a flicker of resistance still burned. Despite the overwhelming fear, the chilling presence of the ghosts, and the weight of the realization that I was trapped, I refused to give in. I couldn't. I wouldn't. I fought against the pull, against the pressure in my chest that told me to surrender. With every ounce of strength I had left, I tried to claw my way back to the shore, to break free of the river's grip. The water swirled violently around me, almost as if the river itself resented my resistance, but I fought back, each movement slow and painful, each breath shallow and ragged. The ghosts circled around me, their faces twisted in pity and terror. Some of them reached out to touch me, to drag me back under, but I shoved them away, desperate to survive. "You can't escape," one of them cried, its voice like a distant wail carried by the wind. "We couldn't escape, and neither will you. The river doesn't let go." I heard their words, but they meant nothing to me. I refused to believe them. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way back to the world I once knew, to the life I had left behind. I couldn't accept this fate. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I tried to focus, to think. What had I missed? What had I failed to understand? Was there something about the river, something about the curse that I could use to break free? I grasped at fragments of memories, trying to make sense of the legends, the warnings, the strange occurrences that had plagued me since my arrival. And then, it hit me, the only thing that could break the river's hold was the will to let go of everything. To surrender completely, to cease resisting and accept the river's power. But that meant giving up, surrendering to the ghosts and the curse. No, I wouldn't do that. I couldn't. I struggled harder, my body weak, my limbs heavy with exhaustion. The river's pull was relentless, but I clung to the idea of escape, to the hope that somehow, some way, I could find my way back to the real world. But as the minutes stretched into hours, as the ghosts pressed closer, their cold fingers grazing my skin, something inside me cracked. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't fight anymore. The weight of the realization settled heavily in my chest. No matter how hard I tried, the river had already claimed me. There was no way back. No way to break the curse. I sank lower into the water, my body moving in slow motion as if the river itself was guiding me deeper. The water was no longer cold, it was freezing, numbing. My thoughts were slipping away, just as the world around me blurred and faded into nothingness. A terrible clarity filled me. The river wasn't just a curse, it was a trap. A place for the lost, the souls who had wandered too far, crossed too many boundaries. And now I was one of them. I wasn't just trapped in the river, I was trapped between worlds. The ghosts, now surrounding me, had no faces left. Their forms were indistinct, shifting in the water like reflections, but I could still feel their presence. They were part of the river now, part of the curse. And soon, I would be, too. The weight in my chest grew heavier, the cold deepened, and I felt myself slipping further, unable to resist, unable to fight. The faces of the ghosts were fading, their whispers turning into a soft hum, and then the river closed in around me completely. In that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't just fighting for my life. I was fighting for my soul. But the river had already won. And as the water consumed me, I knew there would be no escape, no return. The river had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others. And now, I would walk between its banks for eternity, forever lost between worlds. There would be no end, no escape. I was one of them now. The moment I thought I had escaped, the river's grip tightened in ways I couldn't explain. It was as though the water itself had marked me, left an invisible brand on my soul, a constant pull that I couldn't escape. I was no longer on the banks of the river, no longer submerged in its cold depths, but I could still feel its presence, pressing against my chest, twisting in my mind. Each day felt like a battle. Time no longer moved in predictable rhythms. Sometimes, hours stretched into eternity, and other times, they collapsed into mere seconds. The world around me seemed distorted, out of sync. The sun, once a comforting warmth, now felt too harsh, too bright, like it was trying to burn away the darkness that the river had left behind. The shadows of trees seemed to stretch unnaturally, their branches reaching toward me, reminding me of the water, of the ghostly figures still waiting at the edge of my mind. I couldn't escape it. It was like a heavy fog that clung to my every thought, filling the air with an oppressive weight. I would catch myself staring at the river from afar, feeling an inexplicable compulsion to return, to step back into the cold, familiar embrace of its depths. The water had become my undoing, my obsession, and despite every rational thought that warned me of its dangers, I felt the pull stronger each time. I tried to keep myself busy, doing anything to distract myself from the ever-present force that gripped my soul. I tried to walk away from the river, to escape its haunting presence, but it was always there, lurking at the edges of my mind. The pull wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Every moment spent away from the river felt like a fight, like a battle to retain my sanity, to remind myself that I was still in control of my actions. But I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. The mornings came too quickly, each one blurring into the next. I woke in a haze, disoriented, my mind fogged by nightmares of walking along the riverbank, staring into the dark, swirling waters that seemed to beckon me. But when I opened my eyes, I was always somewhere else, away from the river, away from the cold and the ghosts, yet still trapped in its grip. It was as though the world around me had stopped making sense. The air felt thick, heavy with a pressure I couldn't explain. The land seemed distorted, like I was walking through a half-remembered dream. The distant rustling of trees sounded too much like the whisper of the water, the wind carrying with it a faint echo of footsteps that weren't mine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The eyes of the river, the eyes of the ghosts, were on me. Always. Waiting. I had to fight to resist, to convince myself that I wasn't going mad. But with every passing hour, the river's pull grew stronger, more insistent. I had to stay away. I had to. But it wasn't enough. I felt myself slipping, my resolve fading with every minute spent apart from the river's grasp. It was like trying to escape an invisible force, like being trapped in quicksand. The harder I struggled, the deeper I sank. I could feel the pull in my bones, a sensation that gripped my very heart, pulling me toward the water. I knew what it meant if I returned. I'd be lost again, trapped in the cycle, trapped between worlds. The ghosts would find me, and I would join them in their endless walk across the river, their souls bound by a curse I couldn't understand. But there was nothing left to hold on to. No place to hide. I could feel the river's cold breath on the back of my neck. It was coming for me, slowly, silently. I could hear its whispers in my dreams, feel its fingers brush against my skin, pulling me closer. And even though I knew the danger, even though I could feel the dread growing, I could also feel that pull, impossible to ignore. I was running out of time. The river was waiting. And no matter how far I tried to run, I knew I would eventually return. It was only a matter of when, not if. The struggle continued, but the grip was tightening. I was slipping. The voices started faint, almost like whispers on the wind, and at first, I thought I imagined them, fragments of nightmares seeping into the daylight hours. But as the days wore on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became voices, clear and sharp, calling my name, beckoning me. I tried to ignore them at first. I told myself it was nothing but the remnants of my mind unraveling, a side effect of fear, exhaustion, and isolation. But with each passing day, the voices grew clearer, more distinct, and soon I could no longer deny them. They were coming from the river. I couldn't escape it. The call of the river was not just a sound, but a presence, a force that seemed to reach inside me, like invisible hands pulling at my soul, tugging me back toward the water. The ghosts, their voices, grew louder with every step I took away from the river's edge, as though the distance between us was a challenge they refused to accept. I could feel the pull, deep in my chest, like a thread wrapped around my heart, drawing me closer to the river. The land beneath my feet seemed to grow heavier with each step I took away, as though the earth itself was urging me back, as though it knew the river was calling for me. The trees bent toward me, their branches curling like fingers, as if trying to hold me in place. The air itself felt charged, thick with the oppressive weight of the water's power. I tried to fight it, to walk faster, to distance myself from the edge of the river. But the more I tried to run, the stronger the pull became. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a sickening tug that twisted me inside out. The voices, soft at first, were now urgent, rising to a crescendo in my mind. "Come back," they whispered. "Come back to us." The words were laced with sorrow, but also something darker, something that chilled me to my very core. It was as if the river itself was calling me, its currents reaching out to claim me once again. I tried to drown out the sound, to cover my ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside me, pulling at my thoughts, bending my will. Every time I tried to remember my past, to focus on anything other than the river, it slipped through my fingers, like sand drifting away in the wind. My memories, once sharp and vivid, were fading, becoming distant echoes. Faces I once knew blurred and vanished. The people I loved, the life I had left behind, were becoming ghosts themselves, lost to me, like faded photographs with edges curling into nothingness. In their place, the river was all I could think about. The river was becoming my past, my future, my everything. The faces of the ghosts, those who had walked the water before me, appeared in flashes, haunting my thoughts. I could see them walking on the surface, their eyes vacant, their bodies frozen in a never-ending trance. They were lost, just as I was. They were waiting, just as I was. I shook my head, trying to hold on to the last remnants of myself, trying to fight the pull that dragged me toward the river's edge. But the river's grip was too strong. It was as if the earth itself was shifting beneath me, as if the very world was collapsing around me, leaving only the river behind. I tried to run. I tried to escape. But my body betrayed me. My legs moved slower, my feet dragging against the ground, as if they had become as heavy as the river itself. My mind was clouded, my thoughts scattered, and all I could hear, all I could feel, was the pull of the water. "Come back," they whispered again, their voices growing louder, more insistent. "We're waiting for you." I had no strength left to fight. I could feel my resolve crumbling, like the last fading light before darkness overtakes. The river was calling me, and I could no longer deny it. It wasn't just a call, it was a command. I had no choice but to listen. I turned, unable to stop myself. My body moved of its own accord, as though some unseen force had taken control. Each step toward the river felt inevitable, as though I had already crossed some invisible line, and there was no turning back. I was being pulled in, drawn toward the water like a moth to the flame. And as I walked closer, I could feel the cold mist rising from the river, the chilling sensation of its touch creeping up my skin. The water was waiting for me, and I was ready to surrender. My memories, my past, the world I once knew, everything was slipping away, replaced by the river's cold embrace. And as I stepped closer to the edge, I could feel the water's breath on my face, and I knew deep down that there would be no return this time. The river had already claimed me, body and soul. I had answered its call. I was lost, and there was no way back. I could no longer deny the truth that had been clawing at me from the moment I first heard the river's call. The voices, the pull, the ghosts, they weren't just fragments of a broken mind. They were real. The river wasn't just a body of water, a serene flow that wound its way through the land. No. It was a living, breathing thing, a force that was as old as the earth itself. and I was nothing more than a prisoner in its grasp. But I refused to become another soul lost to the current. I had lost too much already: memories, people, my sense of self, and I couldn't allow the river to take any more. It had already stolen my past, but it would not steal my future. I wasn't ready to surrender. There was a moment, a single moment, when the weight of the curse, the pull of the river, grew so unbearable that I reached my breaking point. I stood on the edge of the riverbank, trembling, heart racing, as I faced the truth of what had happened to me and countless others. The whispers in my mind, the shadows I had seen in the water, they were all part of the same horrifying reality. I knew what I had to do. With every step, I felt my strength returning, an ancient force rising inside me, pushing back against the pull that had almost consumed me. I couldn't fight the water's call by running, by hiding, by pretending it was just a bad dream. It wasn't. It was real. And I had to confront it, head on. The night was thick with fog, the air still, as I approached the river again. My pulse pounded in my ears, but with each step, I grew more resolute. The voices, once whispers, now shouted in my mind. The ghosts, those who had been pulled into the river's grasp before me, called to me, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of despair and anger. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had already been to the other side, walked the line between worlds. I had faced the ghosts, and now I knew the truth. They weren't there to guide me, to warn me, as I had once believed. No, they were the cursed, trapped in an endless cycle of wandering the river's banks. They were victims, just like me, bound by the river's unbreakable chain. I stepped closer to the water, each movement deliberate. The air grew colder, the water darker, as if the river itself recognized my intent. The pull of the current pressed against me, urging me to surrender, to step into its depths. But I stood firm. I would not let it claim me, not without a fight. I had to find this source, the heart of the curse. I had to learn why this river, this force, was so powerful and what it wanted from me. And somehow, I knew the answers were buried beneath the surface, waiting for me to uncover them. I had heard the stories, the rumors whispered by the locals, tales of lost travelers, of souls caught in the river's grasp, never able to escape. But they didn't tell you everything. They didn't speak of the power that lay within the water, the ancient curse that had bound it to the land. The truth was more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. The river was alive, in a way that no human being could understand. It wasn't just water, it was a conduit for something older than time itself. A dark force, a being that fed on souls, drawing them in, claiming them, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment. It didn't just claim the living, it took the essence of those who died, binding their spirits to the river, making them part of its current. Forever. I could feel the weight of this knowledge crushing me, but it also lit a fire within me, a fire that drove me forward, pushed me into the river's depths, where I had to find the answer. I wasn't just fighting for my life anymore. I was fighting for the countless souls who had been claimed by this cursed water. I had to break the cycle. I had to set them free. The answer came in a flash, in a moment of clarity as the river's pull grew stronger. The curse had a source. A heart, a power at the very center of the river, hidden beneath its surface, waiting to be awakened. That was where the answer lay, and I had to reach it. I had to find a way to destroy it, to sever the tie that bound the river to this world. I didn't know how I would do it. I didn't know what would happen if I succeeded or if I failed. But I knew one thing, I couldn't leave this place without trying. I had to face the river, face whatever horrors it had in store for me. It was the only way to end the curse, to save myself and the others who were still trapped in its current. With trembling hands, I stepped into the water, my heart pounding in my chest. The coldness hit me like a shock, the current rushing around my legs, as if the river itself were testing my resolve. I took a deep breath, steadying myself against the pull, against the dark forces that called to me. This was it. The moment of truth. There was no turning back now. I would either break the curse, or I would join the ranks of the lost souls, doomed to wander these shores forever. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. I had come too far. And this time, I would fight. The water was cold. It crept up my legs, pulling with an insistent force, as though the river itself were trying to drag me under. I stood on the edge, the sound of the current roaring in my ears, and I felt it again, the pull, deep and unrelenting, like invisible fingers wrapped around my soul. I had crossed into the other side once, and now, here I stood again, on the threshold of the final battle. There was no turning back. The spirits of the river were waiting for me, gathered along the bank, their pale faces twisted with a mix of agony and anger. They watched me with hollow eyes, their expressions frozen in eternal torment. They were not just ghosts, they were the damned, the lost souls who had been taken by the river's curse and condemned to wander its shores forever. Their pale forms shimmered in the moonlight, translucent and eerie, and I could feel their gazes penetrate my very being. "You cannot escape," one of them whispered, her voice a soft, mournful wail. It was a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the water, as if the river itself had given birth to these cries. "You are one of us now. There is no place for you beyond the river." I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing. The cold that seeped into my bones wasn't just the water, it was their presence, the weight of their suffering, pressing down on me like 1,000 heavy stones. The river had claimed them, and it was now reaching for me, its grip tightening with every step I took toward the water's edge. "I'm not like you," I said, my voice trembling but defiant. "I won't stay here." The air around me thickened, a dense fog rising from the surface of the water, swirling like a living thing. The ghosts began to move toward me, their forms becoming more distinct, more human. But they were no longer the faces of lost travelers, they were the faces of those who had been devoured by the river, their souls twisted and deformed by its power. They were no longer just victims, they were part of the river, bound to it for eternity. "You will never leave," one ghost hissed, stepping closer. The others followed, surrounding me like a horde. "We are all bound here, trapped between life and death. You will join us, just as we joined the river." The terror in my chest constricted. They were right. The river was powerful, more powerful than I had ever imagined. It was a force of nature, a curse that had claimed countless lives, and now it was trying to claim me. But there was something more, something in their words, in the way they spoke. It wasn't just about the river. It was about something deeper, something darker. I looked at them, really looked at them, and for the first time, I saw it. The sorrow, the regret, the hopelessness. These were not just souls damned by a curse, they were people, once living, once whole, now trapped in a nightmarish existence they couldn't escape. "Please," I whispered, stepping forward, my voice breaking. "How do I break free? How do I stop this?" The ghosts paused, their expressions flickering. One of them, a man with hollow, sunken eyes, stepped closer. His voice was a rasp, his words jagged and fragmented. "The curse cannot be broken," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The river demands a price. The spirits, Those who have crossed are the price. The river consumes and gives nothing back. I felt a deep pit of despair open inside me, but I refused to give in. I couldn't. If there was even the slightest chance of escape, of freeing myself from this nightmare, I had to take it. The ghosts were trapped here, yes, but that didn't mean I had to be. I wasn't like them. Not yet. And then I heard it. A voice, deep and guttural, rising from the water itself. It wasn't the voice of a ghost, it was something much darker. Your choice, the river's voice said, its words echoing in my mind. Live, or join the others. The river's grip tightened on me, pulling at my very soul, the weight of it almost unbearable. I could feel it now, the force of the curse, like an immense hand reaching for me from beneath the water. The ghosts had become mere shadows around me, their faces twisted in silent agony as I stood, trembling, at the brink of the river's depths. I had to choose. I could feel the pull toward the water, toward the ghosts, toward the end of the line. It was an easy path, the familiar one, the one where I would join them, a part of the river's endless current. I would never have to struggle again. The darkness would consume me, and I would no longer feel the weight of this world. The ghosts would be my family, the river my home. But there was something else, a spark of defiance deep inside me, something that refused to give in. I had crossed the threshold once. I had seen what lay beyond the river, the world that still had a place for me. I could not let it all slip away, not without a fight. I stood taller, my fists clenched at my sides, as the river's voice echoed in my mind. Choose, traveler. Live or die. The ghosts crowded closer, their cold, clammy hands reaching for me, their eyes pleading for me to join them. But I knew the truth now. I wasn't just fighting for my life, I was fighting for my soul. For my future. With a burst of determination, I turned away from the water. I ran. I ran from the river's grip, from the ghosts, from the suffocating terror that had tried to drag me under. The spirits screamed, their voices a chorus of rage and sorrow, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I didn't know if I would make it, if I would ever truly be free of the river's curse. But I knew one thing, I would never surrender. Not to the river, not to the ghosts, not to the darkness. I would fight for as long as I could. And that, I thought, was the only choice I could make. The wind howled through the trees, snapping branches and whipping the leaves into frenzied spirals. The river's surface churned violently, reflecting the moonlight in sharp, jagged patterns. I had run as far as I could, but I could feel it, the river still tugging at me, its call seeping through the ground, through the air, through my very skin. I stopped, breathless, heart pounding in my chest, as the sound of rushing water filled my ears. My mind screamed for me to keep moving, but my body betrayed me. The pull was too strong, like an invisible thread attached to my soul, drawing me back toward the water, toward the ghosts. They were still there, watching from the edges of my vision, their faces twisted in silent, eternal agony. I had made my choice. I had turned my back on the river, but it wasn't done with me. I stumbled to my knees, my legs failing beneath me. The coldness in the air wasn't just from the wind, it was the river, creeping in, chilling me to the bone. The whispers started again, soft at first, just echoes, then louder, more insistent, as though they were calling my name. Come back, they whispered. Come back and join us. Forever. The weight of the curse pressed in on me, heavier than before. I could feel the river's power, suffocating and oppressive. It was pulling at my thoughts, dragging me toward the edge of the world, to a place where there was no escape. The ghosts were waiting, their forms now visible in the fog, their eyes filled with a kind of hunger. I had fought as long as I could, but the river's grip was relentless. I could see now that there was no way to truly break the curse. The river had claimed so many before me, and it would claim me, too. There was no escaping its reach. No fighting it. But then, a flicker of thought, a glimmer of hope. The ghosts had said that the river demanded a price, that it consumed, but never gave back. There had to be a way to end it. A way to stop it from claiming any more lives. I closed my eyes and steadied my breath, focusing on that sliver of hope. If I was going to lose, if I was going to become just another shadow on the river's shore, I at least had to do one thing: break the cycle. With every ounce of strength I had left, I stood. The ghost's voices echoed louder now, almost deafening, but I could hear something else, a heartbeat. Not mine. Something older, something that pulsed beneath the river, beneath the earth itself. It was the heart of the curse, the source of its power. The river began to tremble, the water rippling violently as though it could sense my resistance. I could feel the pull weakening, like it was losing its grip on me, but the closer I got to the water's edge, the more intense the force became. I stepped into the river, ignoring the cold that burned through my legs. I could feel the pull, the suffocating weight of the curse, but I refused to let it break me. I waded deeper, past the shallows, until the current was up to my chest. And then I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing on the water, walking toward me. One of the ghosts. But this one wasn't like the others. Its eyes were not hollow, they were full of sorrow, but there was something else, something like understanding. "Why do you fight?" it asked, its voice soft, like the wind. "There is no escape. The river claims all who enter." "I won't be another soul lost to this curse," I replied, my voice hoarse, but steady. "I will find a way to stop it." The ghost's face softened, as though it understood, but then the water around me surged, dragging me deeper, pulling me under. I fought with everything I had, but the current was too strong. The last thing I saw was the ghost, standing still on the surface, watching me. Its eyes were filled with sadness, as if it knew that even if I fought, even if I resisted, there would be no escaping the river's endless grip. The world went black. I woke up on the bank again. The river was calm, almost serene, and the night sky stretched endlessly above. My body ached, my mind clouded with confusion. The air felt thicker, colder, like I had never left. I looked around, but nothing had changed. The same trees, the same fog that hung over the water. The ghosts were still there, standing along the shore, their faces watching me, waiting. The river's pull was still there, but now it felt different, fainter, almost as if it had loosened its grip, but only for a moment. I didn't know if I had broken the curse. I didn't know if I had truly won. But the river was still there, and the ghosts were still walking the water. And as I stood there, the sound of rushing water filling my ears once again, I realized there was no end. The river would never stop. It would always claim more souls. And now, I was one of them. I was trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead, lost to the river, with no way out. The only thing that remained was the knowledge that another soul would cross soon, and the river would reach for them, too. It always did. It always would. And the cycle would continue, unbroken. The river's grip would never release. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that made the world feel fresh, like it had been washed clean by the rain. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the riverbank. The water gleamed in the dying light, its surface rippling lazily as if it had no care in the world. As I stood at the edge of the river, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but a strange sense of déjà vu clung to me like a second skin, wrapping around my thoughts, tightening with each passing second. I had never been here before, yet everything about this place felt eerily familiar. The curve of the river, the trees on the opposite bank, the way the mist seemed to rise from the water in slow spirals, it was all too perfect, too like something I had seen before. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I had just arrived, and everything was new, wasn't it? The cabin stood just a few feet behind me, small and rustic, nestled between two gray oaks. I had rented it for the weekend, hoping for some peace and quiet away from the hustle and bustle of city life. A place to clear my mind. A place to breathe. But as I glanced over the river, the first stirrings of unease began to creep in. The silence around me seemed too deep, too absolute, like the whole world had gone still. And the water, there was something about it. It wasn't just the way it looked, it was the way it moved. Or, rather, the way it didn't. The current should have been stronger, more noticeable, but it barely stirred. I rubbed my arms, a chill running through me despite the warm breeze. I couldn't explain it, but something was calling me to the river, urging me to step closer, to let the water draw me in. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, like an invisible thread pulling at my chest. But then I caught sight of something, movement on the water. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light. Perhaps a fish had breached the surface, or a breeze had caused the water to ripple. But no! The figure, barely visible at the far end of the river, wasn't like anything I had seen before. It was a person, or at least, it seemed to be. A tall figure, standing perfectly still on the water, its shape distorted by the mist. My heart skipped a beat, and for a fleeting second, I felt a rush of panic. But then the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the shadows of the trees. I blinked, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks on me again. I tried to shake off the feeling. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the strange sense of familiarity only deepened. I had seen that figure before. I had felt this sense of unease before. And that's when the truth settled into my chest like a stone, heavy and cold. It was the same. The river was the same. The curse, the pull, the whispers that followed, all of it was the same. The cycle was beginning again. I could feel it now, the invisible thread pulling at me, urging me toward the water. I tried to ignore it, tried to remind myself that I had come here to escape, to be free. But the weight of it, the river's call, was undeniable. I glanced back at the cabin. There was no escaping it. The river had a grip on this place, on all who ventured too close, and it wasn't about to let go. Not this time. Not ever. The eerie silence returned, even deeper now, and I knew that this wasn't just a place I had stumbled upon by chance. This was the beginning of something much darker. Something that had claimed others before and would do so again. I took one step toward the water, then another. The cycle had started, and there was no turning back. The moment I stepped closer to the river, the air shifted, as though the very atmosphere had thickened, pulling tighter around me. My thoughts felt foggy, like I was wading through a dream. I couldn't quite grasp the feeling, but it was familiar, a sensation I had felt before in the darkest corners of my mind. The pull of the river, the weight of the unseen presence, it was all here, again. At first, the whispering was subtle, like the faint rustle of leaves in a breeze. I paused, looking around, but there was no one. No one but me and the river. Yet, the whispers seemed to float in the air, filling the silence. They weren't loud, but the more I listened, the clearer they became, unmistakably human voices, distant and fragmented. "Don't go closer." I froze. My heart skipped, and I turned in a circle, looking for the source. But there was no one. Only the river, its surface shimmering as the mist began to rise in the evening light, cloaking the edges of the water in a thin, eerie veil. "Turn back, or you'll be lost." The voice was so close now, almost as if it was right next to me. Yet, there was no one around. The words seeped into my mind, curling into my thoughts like vines twisting around a tree. A warning. A plea. I shook my head, trying to clear the disorienting weight that was settling over me. It was just the wind, I told myself, just my imagination running wild. I had been alone too long, isolated from the world, surrounded by the unnatural stillness of the river. It had to be that. But then I heard another voice, this time a murmur, so soft it was almost a sigh. "She's here. She can hear us." I stiffened, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. The words weren't just random, these were fragments of something more. Something that had happened before. Something that would happen again. I backed away, retreating several steps, but it was like my feet weren't listening. The pull was back, stronger now, tightening around me like invisible ropes. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I could hear them in my ears, in my mind, racing to outpace my thoughts. They were calling me, each voice distinct and frantic, warning me of what would come. "You'll never leave, never escape." I stopped, suddenly aware of how close I was to the water. I could feel it now, a coldness creeping up from the depths, pushing against the soles of my shoes. My feet trembled, wanting to move away, but they wouldn't. The whispers, the voices, they were too compelling, too real. "Don't follow, the water will take you." I spun around, desperate to escape the pull, but the earth beneath me seemed to shift. The trees seemed farther away, and the river, once so distant, now felt far too close. The voices came from all directions, mingling with the wind, blending into one endless hum. The sense of déjà vu washed over me again. The same voices. The same warning. The same curse. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The force holding me here was not just physical, it was inside me, inside my thoughts. I could feel the river, beckoning me with its deep, dark promise. I could hear the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "She's here." Just like before. I knew then, with terrifying clarity, that I wasn't the first to be drawn here. I wasn't the first to hear these voices, to feel the curse of the river calling me in. I was just another piece in its endless cycle. I turned, trying to walk back to the cabin, but my legs felt as though they were rooted to the ground. The voices followed me, echoing in my mind. There was no escaping them. No escaping this place. Turn back, before it's too late. But it already was. The river had a hold on me, and no matter how much I fought, I was already lost. Despite my attempts to fight it, despite the creeping panic clawing at my chest, my feet moved. Slowly at first, then faster as if some unseen force was tugging me forward. The whispers had faded, but the pull was undeniable, stronger than my will to resist. I didn't want to go closer to the river. I knew I shouldn't, but every step felt as though it was not my own. My body moved without permission, as though it had forgotten its autonomy, as though the river had already claimed me. The air around me grew thicker, suffocating in its stillness. The river, once a peaceful sight in the daylight, now seemed to twist and writhe beneath the surface. The ripples were wrong, unsteady, jagged, as if something was moving beneath the water, something unseen but felt. I couldn't stop. My legs, heavy and reluctant, kept pushing me forward, and with each step, the shadows along the riverbank seemed to grow darker, deeper. The trees that once looked inviting now loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches creaking in the stillness. The world had become distorted, stretching and warping like a nightmare where nothing was quite right. And then, I heard them. Whispers. Not from the wind this time, but from the very air around me. Voices so soft, so close, they could have been speaking directly into my ear. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that the river wasn't just calling me, it was guiding me. Come closer. The voice was sweet, almost kind, but laced with something that made my heart race. It was gentle, coaxing, urging me to step closer to the water's edge. The shadows along the bank stirred, and I could feel a presence just beyond my vision. I tried to shake it off, but my legs moved faster. I couldn't stop them. My feet were leading me, drawing me into the heart of the mist that seemed to swirl just above the water. The land around me became distorted, the trees bending and stretching as though they were alive, reaching out to grab me, to pull me into their dark embrace. And then I saw them. Figures, tall, pale shapes, moving just beyond the mist, their forms indistinct, but somehow familiar. At first, they were nothing but shadows, barely noticeable in the fog, but then they began to take shape. Faces, hollow and drawn, appeared in the mist. Eyes that were both empty and knowing, fixed on me. They didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming. Each one of them seemed to move in unison, as if they were following some invisible rhythm, an ancient dance. Join us. The voice was cold now, devoid of the softness it once held. It was commanding. It was demanding. I couldn't move back. The water was too close now, its cold, unfeeling surface glistening under the moonlight. My feet were dragging, unwilling, but they were still moving forward. The ghosts began to emerge from the mist, their forms clearer now, no longer hiding in shadows. They walked across the water as if it were solid ground, their feet gliding just above the surface, leaving no trace. Their hollow eyes fixed on me, their mouths opening and closing as though trying to speak, but no words came out. Only the whispers continued. She is here, like the others. She must join us. The water moved, ripples forming where none should have been. It was as if the river itself was alive, beckoning me to step in, to cross its threshold. My mind screamed to turn away, to fight, but my body was no longer mine to command. I was nothing but puppet to this ancient force. The water called to me, the figures on the river's edge growing more distinct, more urgent, as they reached out with ghostly hands. Come, they whispered. The cycle must continue. My feet were no longer walking, they were drifting, as though I were weightless, drawn by the river's will. I was no longer afraid, not in the way I had been before. The terror had been replaced by something else, a hollow, numbing acceptance. It was as if I had always been meant to be here, to follow the same path that countless others had walked before me. The cycle. The endless loop. The last thing I could hear before everything faded into the mist was the soft sound of footsteps on the water, silent but unmistakably there. And then, just as I reached the edge, the ghosts were upon me. Their cold hands brushed against my skin, pulling me into the water. There was no escape. The river had already claimed me, and I was nothing more than another echo, another lost soul walking its endless path. I could feel the coldness of the water now, creeping up around my ankles, its touch as icy and unrelenting as the ghosts who had gathered around me. The figures were so close now, their shapes almost tangible in the thick mist, and their eyes, those hollow eyes, stared at me with an emptiness that seemed to stretch into eternity. I didn't want to move. My legs screamed for me to stop, but they continued, as though the river's grip was no longer something I could resist. The water lapped at my knees, sending a shiver up my spine. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. It was as if all the fear had drained out of me, leaving only a cold numbness behind. A part of me knew this wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the other part, the part that had been walking in these footsteps for so long, accepted it. I was meant to be here. I was part of this. The ghosts, their faces so pale they were almost translucent, moved in synchrony, surrounding me as I stepped deeper into the river. They whispered to me, urging me onward, as if pushing me towards something I could neither understand nor escape. "You will never leave," they murmured. "You will walk with us forever." Their voices blended with the soft murmur of the river, like a song, and I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. It was a lullaby of sorrow, of loss. And as I continued to walk, the water rose higher, slowly swallowing my legs, pulling me in. I tried to resist again, tried to step back, but it was as though the river had grown a life of its own, pulling me further in with invisible hands, urging me to take the last step. The mist thickened around me, pressing on my senses. It felt like a dream, like a memory that didn't belong to me but to someone else. A memory that had been passed down through generations of lost souls, all walking toward the same end, never questioning, never escaping. The last step came with a quiet inevitability. My foot sank deeper into the water, and as my body followed, it was like stepping into a different world altogether. The river had claimed me fully now. My heart didn't race, my breath didn't catch. There was no panic, no fear, just a deep, resigned knowing. This was where I belonged. This was where I had always belonged. The pull of the river, the voices of the ghosts, they had been a part of me from the very beginning. I felt myself slip beneath the surface. The cool water closed over my head, and the world became muffled, distant. I had no breath, but I wasn't drowning. I wasn't fighting. The darkness surrounded me, and I could see nothing but the void. Then I understood. The ghosts weren't here to take me, they were here to guide me. And I had become one of them. I felt my body shift, my spirit rising, as if no longer confined by flesh. I walked, not on land, not on water, but somewhere in between. The river had claimed another soul, and the cycle continued, as it always would. Forever. The last thing I heard before everything faded was the whispering of the river, soft and haunting. "Welcome home." The river was calm again, its surface smooth and unbroken, as if nothing had ever happened. The mist had dissipated, the whispers faded into silence, and all that remained was the endless, steady flow of water, a force as ancient and unyielding as time itself. But beneath that surface, in the depths where the light never touched, something shifted. The ghosts had disappeared, their voices swallowed by the current. And yet, I knew, I could feel it, the weight of their presence still lingered. Their journey was mine now, their fate entwined with my own. I had joined the river, become a part of it. The pull, the lure, the whispering call, it was all mine to carry forward, like a heavy stone tied to my chest. I could not escape it, nor could I deny it. Somewhere far off, on the distant banks of the river, a new figure appeared, a traveler, unaware of the curse that clung to this place. Their steps were hesitant, the world around them unfamiliar, yet there was something in their eyes, a fleeting recognition, as if they had always known they would end up here. I watched them from my new place, neither on land nor water, but somewhere in between. I could see the way they paused, felt the same strange pull toward the river, just as I had. The cycle was about to begin again. The traveler took a few tentative steps closer to the water. The wind carried a soft murmur, as if the river itself was beckoning them, drawing them in. The ghosts, once lost to me, now stirred beneath the surface, their whispers returning. They would guide this new soul, just as they had guided me. And the river would claim another. I reached out, but my hands were no longer real, no longer bound by flesh. I could not stop the inevitable. The current would rise, and they would walk toward it, just as I had done. The voices would become louder, the water colder, and soon they would feel the same resignation I had known, knowing that, once you step into the river, there is no return. The traveler would take their last step, and the cycle would repeat. Another soul bound to the river's curse, destined to walk its endless path, trapped between the banks, forevermore. And so, as I watched, I knew my place in the legend was sealed. The river, like the ghosts, was timeless, unchanging. It would continue to claim souls, one by one, until there was no one left to claim. The river's song would never stop, and the cycle would never end. I woke, though I couldn't say when. The river was still, its surface unbroken, stretching endlessly ahead of me. But it felt different now. I could feel the weight of the water in the air, heavy with secrets, heavy with time. The mist clung to the banks, soft and familiar, yet strangely colder than before. I didn't know how I had arrived here, nor how long I had been walking. Time had lost all meaning. My feet moved of their own accord, the sound of each step absorbed by the soft earth beneath. I looked around, but there was nothing to see but the river and the endless stretch of land that surrounded it. The same land, the same river, the same everything. I didn't know who I was anymore. My memories felt distant, as if they were someone else's. Flickers of faces, of places, of a life I could no longer grasp. The river had taken them all, everything that once made me whole, leaving only an empty space where my identity had been. I didn't know my name. I didn't know where I had come from or why I was here. All I knew was the river, the pull, the endless walk. There was a faint, nagging sense that I had been here before, but it was like a dream slipping through my fingers, too far gone to remember clearly. The land I walked on felt both foreign and intimate, as if I had traversed these paths countless times before, but with no real sense of how or when. The figures of others, ghosts, appeared before me, fading in and out of the mist like shadows of my past. Their faces, as pale as moonlight, were marked with the same hollow emptiness that I felt inside. They walked along the river with me, their steps silent and steady. I could feel their presence, a collective of souls bound to this place, just as I was now. They didn't speak. There was no need for words. We all knew our purpose. A strange comfort, or perhaps resignation, washed over me. I was no longer alone, and yet I had never truly been alone. We were all trapped in the same cycle, each of us a shadow of our former selves, wandering this endless river for eternity. I tried to remember who I was, but the harder I reached for those forgotten pieces, the more they slipped away. It was as though the river had claimed my past, consumed it entirely, until I was nothing but an echo of what once was. And the river's curse, its pull, its call, grew stronger with each passing step. I could no longer resist it, nor did I want to. I walked forward, the only thing I was certain of in this strange, haunting place. There was no end. There was no beginning. Only the endless walk along the banks of the river. The others around me began to fade, one by one, their figures lost in the shifting mist. But I kept walking, step after step, deeper into the heart of the river's embrace. The river was home now, and I was just another lost soul, another ghost bound to its banks. I didn't know how much time had passed, or if time had even passed at all. But I knew one thing for sure, I would walk forever. There would never be an end to this. This was my fate now, an endless journey along the river's edge, forever a shadow of what I once was. Forever lost. The river, timeless and unyielding, claimed another soul, and the cycle began anew. The water lapped gently at the shore as I walked. The sound was distant, a hollow murmur that echoed against the fog. My feet skimmed the surface of the water, though it was not quite like walking on solid ground. The sensation was odd, weightless, as if my body had lost its connection to the world it once belonged to. I wasn't alone, though I didn't remember why I had first joined them. Figures shuffled ahead of me, their steps steady and unyielding, as if they had walked this same path for countless years. They were the others, lost souls like me, bound to the river. I could see them, but they were fading, just as I had been fading, their outlines blurred and distant, their faces as featureless as mine. We moved together, the silence between us heavy, but no one spoke. We were beyond conversation, beyond any human need. We walked, and we kept walking, our destination unknown, as unchanging as the river itself. I had no idea how long it had been. The river stretched endlessly ahead, its banks an unbroken line of darkness that seemed to draw us forward, step by step, until the end of time itself. My legs moved without thought, the rhythm of walking in sync with the others, an unspoken agreement that we were all headed in the same direction, toward an unknown fate. The feeling of isolation grew as I walked, a deep, gnawing ache that I could not escape. There were no voices now, no sounds except the gentle ripple of water and the shuffle of footsteps on the soft earth. I could hear the others, their movements, but it felt as though we were growing further apart. No one looked at each other, no one made a sound. We were all walking in the same direction, but we were alone in our thoughts. The river's call was always there, silent but insistent, drawing us closer to it with each passing moment. The pull was not physical, it was something far deeper, a tug on the soul, urging us to keep moving forward. We couldn't resist it, even if we tried. It was as much a part of us now as the breath in our lungs, or whatever remained of it. As I glanced at the figures ahead, I began to realize that some of them were becoming more like the ghosts I had seen before, faint echoes of their former selves. Their forms were dissolving into the mist, leaving only shadows behind. And yet, they didn't stop. They kept walking, moving in rhythm with the river's eternal current. I wanted to call out to them, to ask if they knew anything, if they knew where this path led. But the words caught in my throat, swallowed by the thick air, as if the river itself refused to let me speak. I couldn't recall how I had come to this place, but I could feel it deep in my bones now. The river had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others before. I was part of its haunting now, part of the endless journey. The sense of loss that gripped me tightened like a vice. Who had I been before this? What had I left behind? I didn't know. The memories, those fleeting fragments of a life I had once known, were slipping away, fading faster with each step. I could no longer remember my name. I could no longer remember the world I had left behind. All that remained was the river and the endless walk. A deep loneliness settled within me, an aching emptiness that had no end. I could feel the weight of it pulling me down, heavier than the water beneath my feet. No matter how far I walked, I knew there would never be an end to this journey. And yet, I couldn't stop. I couldn't escape it. As the others drifted farther away, absorbed into the fog, I realized that they were not the ones fading, they were leaving me behind. I was being left in the depths of the river's curse, and I would walk this path forever, just like them. The world outside the river was lost to me, and all that remained was the endless horizon, the empty stretch of water that would never end. The river would never let me go, and I would never stop walking. As I walked, the fog thickened, swirling around me like a living thing, and with it came the sudden rush of memories. At first, they were fleeting, tiny, fragmented flashes of images I couldn't quite piece together. The sharp sting of a forgotten name, a glimpse of a place I had once called home. They flickered like distant stars, too far out of reach, but each one sent a jolt through me, a reminder of something I had lost. Then the floodgates opened. I could see it all, clearer than ever before, though it brought no comfort. The memories were not mine anymore, at least, not as I had once known them. They felt foreign, twisted by the river's curse, distorted by the endless walk. I remembered standing by the water, just as I had on that fateful night, the same pull drawing me to the edge. I had looked into the dark, murky depths, and something had called to me, something ancient, something powerful. But I had ignored it then. I had tried to walk away, to convince myself that the fear was all in my mind. How wrong I had been. I felt the weight of my choices now, and they pressed down on me like an unbearable burden. The faces of the people I once loved appeared before me, their expressions distorted with grief, as if they knew what I was becoming. I could see them calling to me, but the words were muffled, lost to the wind. How had I abandoned them? How had I let myself fall into the river's grasp? The reality of what I had become began to settle in, the full horror of it sinking into my chest, suffocating me. I wasn't just walking on the river now, I was a part of it. I was one of them, the lost souls who had once crossed over, only to find themselves condemned to an eternity of wandering. I could feel their presence in the mist around me, the others who had once been like me, living, breathing, full of hope. And now they were gone, swallowed whole by the river. The memories of my former life began to blur into the grotesque, as though my past self had never truly existed. My name felt strange on my lips, as if it belonged to someone else. The life I had lived, the people I had known, they were nothing more than shadows, disappearing with each step I took. I had tried to escape the river once. I had fought against the pull, against the inevitable. But the truth was inescapable. I was trapped. Trapped in a loop, a never-ending cycle that had no beginning or end. Every step forward was just a return to the beginning, every crossing of the river a repetition of what had already happened. I had become part of the legend, the very thing that had haunted me for so long. I was the one now walking on the water, the one who would never be able to break free. The others who had disappeared before me, they were me, and I was them. We were all the same now, and we would walk forever. A scream rose from deep within me, but it was lost in the fog. I had no voice anymore, no power to change what had been done. I had crossed a point of no return, and the river had claimed me as it had claimed so many others. There would be no rescue, no way back. This was my fate now. This was my eternity. I had been the traveler once, the one who had crossed into the unknown, believing that I could escape. But now I was just one more shadow in the mist, just one more lost soul wandering the water, trapped forever in the river's grip. And the cycle would continue. As I walked, the river seemed to come alive around me. The sound of its current had always been a low hum in the back of my mind, a constant presence that I had learned to ignore. But now, it was different. It called to me in a voice I had never heard before, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Let go," it whispered. I froze. The voice came from the water itself, an eerie sound that seemed to reverberate through the fog, threading its way into my very soul. The river's voice was ancient, older than the land itself, and it carried with it a terrible promise, a promise of peace. "Forget it all," it continued, the words wrapping around me like a heavy fog. "Let go of your past, of your pain, of the memories that torment you. Accept what you have become, and in return, you will know rest." The river's voice was soothing, like the caress of an old friend offering comfort, but there was something insidious beneath it. It wasn't just an offer, it was a command, an invitation to surrender, to accept the curse as my own and let go of the desperate fight for escape. It promised an end to the torment, an end to the endless walking, the eternal search for something that didn't exist anymore. For a moment, I hesitated. The thought of peace, of forgetting it all, wasn't that what I had wanted? To end this nightmare, to cease the endless wandering, the constant ache of knowing I could never go back. The river's words made it sound so simple. But something deep within me resisted, a small, stubborn flicker of defiance that refused to let go. I didn't want to forget. I didn't want to be swallowed whole by this place, to become one of the ghosts that had silently watched me for so long. No, I couldn't accept it. Not yet. The river's voice grew louder, more insistent, like a song that was impossible to ignore. Forget the faces you left behind. Forget the life you lost. Embrace the water, and you will know peace. Around me, the ghosts of the river stood silent, watching with empty eyes. They were as bound to this fate as I was now. They, too, had heard the river's whispers long ago, and once been where I was, standing at the edge of the abyss, wondering whether to surrender or fight. But now, they were silent. They were waiting, just as I was, condemned to watch the cycle repeat itself, forever walking on the water. There was no anger in their eyes, no regret. Only resignation. The river's pull grew stronger. I could feel it inside me now, a cold, numbing force pressing down on my chest, urging me to succumb. The fog around me thickened, closing in, and for the first time, I could see the ghosts more clearly. They were not the terrifying, twisted figures I had imagined. They were pale, translucent shadows, moving silently through the mist. Some were familiar, their faces twisted in ways I didn't recognize. Some were strangers, lost to time, forgotten by the world. All were bound to the river, bound to walk for eternity. I turned away from them, but the pull of the river remained relentless and cold. I knew what the river wanted. It wanted me to forget, to accept my fate without resistance, without pain. But could I? Was it even possible to remember what I had been, what I had lost, in this place where time no longer existed? The river's voice called again, softer now, like a lover's whisper. There is no escape, only peace. Only rest. I closed my eyes, as if to block out the sound, but the whisper remained, seeping into my thoughts, curling around my mind like smoke. The temptation to surrender, to finally be free of this endless walk, was overwhelming. But I knew, deep down, that once I gave in, I would be lost forever, consumed by the river's curse. The last thing I heard was the river's final whisper, lingering in my mind like a shadow. Forget, and you will be free. And in that moment, as I stood on the water's edge, I had to make a choice, to embrace the river's offer, to forget everything and be at peace, or to continue walking, knowing that the cycle would never truly end. The ghosts waited. The river waited. And I stood, alone with my decision, as the fog closed in around me. I could feel the weight of the river's gaze on me, like 1,000 unseen eyes, waiting, watching, ready to pull me under. The fog swirled around my feet, thick and suffocating, and the voices of the ghosts faded into a quiet murmur, drowned by the roaring silence in my mind. For so long, I had resisted. I had fought against the inevitable pull, the endless walk across the water, hoping, foolishly, I now realized that there was some escape, some way to break free. But now, as I stood on the edge of the river, I felt it. The finality of it. The certainty. The ghosts were no longer standing apart, silent witnesses to my fate. They were circling, their pale forms drifting in the mist, moving toward me with a soft, mournful grace. Their faces were familiar yet distant, and I saw in their eyes the same sorrow that had once consumed me, the sorrow of being lost, of knowing that there was no return, no way back to the world they had once known. I took one last, shaky breath, and the last trace of my resistance flickered and died. The river had always been a part of this place, a part of me, and now it was pulling me into its depths. It was no longer a question of fighting, it was simply the next step. I placed my foot into the water. The coldness of it crept up my leg like 100 icy hands, but I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. The water's touch seemed familiar, as though it had always been there, as though it was meant to embrace me. With each step, I felt myself slipping further away from the world I had known, the memories of my past unraveling like a thread in the wind. The river claimed me, just as it had claimed the others before me. I could feel my identity dissolving, my name, my life, everything slipping away, until I was nothing more than a shadow, a wraith lost to the mist. I glanced behind me one last time. The ghosts stood still now, their faces calm, their eyes empty of emotion. They were no longer looking at me, they were looking past me, as if they had long ago given up on the idea of escape. And then, without warning, the fog closed in completely. The last remnants of my existence faded with it. There was no more pain, no more fear. There was only the river. Only the walk. I stepped deeper into the water, the current pulling me further from the shore, further from the world of the living. The weight of the river's grip was all-consuming now, and I could feel my essence being absorbed, merging with the water itself. The cycle had begun again, and I was now a part of it. The river had claimed me, as it had claimed countless others before me. I no longer had a name, no past, no future. I was nothing. I was the river. And as I walked, I could hear the whispers begin again, soft at first, but growing louder until they became a chorus of voices, calling to the next soul who would step into the water, who would hear the call of the river and begin their own endless walk. The cycle would never end. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.